Alrighty, it's time for another live stream. We're gonna get going here as soon as a few more of you enter the room. I'm hoping you're staying indoors and not getting baked by the heat, and that my AC will keep up. So we'll see what happens here. Let's see who's first today. Brian's Aquarium, you are first. Good job. Look at that. You pulled it off, buddy. You're the only one. First and only. How about that? Hello, Mr. Reef Buster. Hi, Gabe. Synthetic Reef. Hello. Hey, Mark. Benjamin. Sean. Man, there's a whole bunch of people. You know, Sean, I have to ask you, does anyone ever call you Scene? Because I know it's a weird way of spelling Sean, but I feel like there should be an H in there and a W. Hello, Braveheart. Albert. David. Mike. Shane. Everybody's here. This is awesome. All right, great, guys. I had someone ask me on the last video in the comment section, could you do a stream about the mistakes you've made? You know, the things that went wrong for you in your experience in the hobby. And I was thinking, well, I mean, I kind of share these mistakes in every video. But why not just do a video about mistakes? Maybe it'll help you avoid some. So I actually spent some time really trying to think of what I might have done wrong or what I neglected, what I forgot about. And I came up with a list. I mean, some of it may be familiar to you, but someone else might want to hear them all in a row. So today's going to be story time with Milev. And like I said, maybe you'll find it beneficial to you and help you figure things out. There's no real particular order on these. I just have a list of like 8 things that happened in the last 23 years of being in this hobby. And maybe more things will pop into my head during this stream, but we'll see. So, without any further ado, let's just get into one of the first things that I did, and I bet many of you have done, and that's I left frozen food out on the counter overnight, and you discover it the next day. And it's not these mistakes aren't necessarily big epic disasters. I mean, there are some in there that are horrible, but sometimes it's just those little things where like, man, how did I let that happen? So the question is, what do you do with this food? Because, there's so much of it left. Do you want to waste it? And I've always erred on the side of caution. And if I did accidentally leave a packet out, I threw it away. I just didn't take a chance with my reef, and I chose to just buy a new package. And maybe in that regard, it kind of it's sort of like, when you drive down the highway at really high speed and you get pulled over and you get a ticket, you're more careful on that one piece of highway for a while after that. So by throwing the food away that cost you money, $7, $18, $29, whatever it was, kind of you're paying a little bit of a food ticket, and it helps you remember not to make that mistake twice. We make these errors, it happens. But the point is we want to avoid, repeating it. And we definitely don't want to take that food that sat out overnight, refreeze it, and then put it in our tank. And my concern is that we would be gradually poisoning our reef each time we took some more of that food just because we don't want to waste it. And it's just, you got to be careful. And I just feel like it's not worth the risk. I'd much rather just buy new and not have to even think that there might be something wrong with the food I'm using. Okay. That was an easy one, right? Let's talk about another one that's kind of a weird one. So some people like to dose vitamin C. This is something they came up with, I don't know, about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And the idea was that by dosing vitamin C, it would enhance the coloration of your zoanthids. And so people were dosing vitamin C into their tanks. Now remember, this stream is about the mistakes I made. So it's not just, hey, I just wanted to try something out. No, what had happened was I'd been reading about it, I didn't really care about it, and I wasn't doing it. And one day I was just, tinkering around my reef, and I'm looking at my zoanthids, and they don't look good, and I thought, they could look better. Maybe I'll just dose some vitamin C. So I did it completely off the cuff, without any kind of a plan. I just put in a fixed amount, which was probably about maybe 2 teaspoons, possibly 3 teaspoons mixed up in a cup of tank water, and I let it, dissipate, and then I poured it into the reef. And about 20 minutes later, all of my corals were closed up really tight, especially the LPS. They all sucked into their skeletons, and I'm looking at my reef, and I'm thinking, what happened? What's wrong with you guys? And the vitamin C never entered my head, not even for a moment. I actually looked at everything. I looked for stray electricity. I checked the pumps. I looked for something weird in the sump. I mean, I looked at everything. I couldn't find anything. I called a friend. I said, hey, Dave, just ask me questions. Ask me whatever pops into your head. Maybe you'll help me come up across something. So he says, did you check your skimmer? Did you, is your pump running? What's the temperature of the tank? What's the pH? The logical things. I said, everything is looking normal. And finally he says, well, what did you dose? I'm like, nothing. He's like, you didn't put anything in your tank. And I was like, I don't know, Prodibio. I mean, I always do that. And vitamin C. And he goes, wait, how much vitamin C did you put? I was like, I don't know, probably 2-3 teaspoons, but it's 280 gallons of water. And he said, well, how much do you normally put? And I was like, none. And he said, oh my God, you overdosed vitamin C. And I was like, I did? And he said, yeah, that's one of those things you have to gradually build up to a certain amount. You can't just go willy-nilly in one dose. And see, to me at the time, vitamin C, it's a vitamin. It just seemed so benign and such a non-event. It didn't even occur to me I made a mistake. And, I just poured it in and went on with my day like nothing else had happened. And so what he told me, and my ORP on the tank had dropped, which usually has to do with the oxygen level in the water. And he said, what you've done is you've deprived your entire reef of oxygen, and all your corals are reacting the way they are. And he's like, you should be dosing this every day, and you gradually ramp it up week after week until you get up to 3 teaspoons, and you just put all of it in one day, boom. He says, I'm not surprised. And I was like, what's the cure? What do I do? And he said, well, you're going to need a lot of air. And so I thought, well, all right. So I called Frank's Tanks down the street, and I said, I'm looking for an air pump and then a heavy ceramic stone. So that way, because normally a regular air stone, you put it in the water. I don't know if you've ever, I'm sure you've noticed this, but a lot of times it likes to float at the surface. Even though you have long tubing, it just kind of goes to the top and it blows bubbles at the surface, but there's no air down low in the container of salt water. And so I knew with a ceramic stone hanging low in the tank, I'd actually be putting air into the reef. So I did that. The second thing I did is I took the collection cup off the protein skimmer, and I intentionally created I closed the output of the skimmer so it would overflow like a volcano to get more air on surface area of the body of the skimmer and hopefully into the sump. I raised a power head up high on one end to chop up the surface. I took the ceramic air stone and put it down low in front of a Tunzi or a Vortec pump to blow air bubbles into the reef. I opened the door to the fish room, and then I opened the garage that's behind it, and then I took a huge fan and I put it there to blow in fresh air into the room. And all these things combined helped raise the oxygen level, and I didn't lose anything. So, the mistake was I used something willy-nilly without any thought, without any recipe, and it could have hurt my reef, but I was lucky enough to be able to call a friend and have them talk me through my error and go ahead and correct it in time. So that was good, but it could have been really bad. So it was a mistake. It was a bad one. Another one that may have happened to you in the past, a little minor thing that you may discover or may not, or maybe you've never heard of it, and so I like to bring it up from time to time, and that's that we don't want to overdose iodine. Iodine is part of salt water. It's necessary, and certain things benefit from it more than others, such as shrimp need it to molt. And if you have shrimp in your tank, whether it's cleaner shrimp, peppermint shrimp, skunk shrimp, the blood shrimp, cleaner and skunk is the same thing, the blood shrimp, I don't know, pistol shrimp, all these different kinds of animals that have to molt every so often, I guess even emerald crabs in that regard, they need iodine in the water to help them molt. And so I had a 29-gallon aquarium going for, I had a total of 7 years. But at one point someone said, you need to be dosing iodine. Don't you know this? I was like, no, I don't, since I can't test for it, I don't use it. And they said, no, it's really important. You should do that. So I was at the store and they had something called Lugel's solution, which is a very concentrated iodine with a little dropper that you unscrew and squeeze, and then you put your drops in the water. And the rule of thumb was 1 drop per 50 gallons. And I had a 29-gallon aquarium with a sump underneath, but maybe back then, no, I'm pretty sure the sump was already involved. But even then, with sand and rock displacement inside the tank itself, there probably wasn't 18 gallons in the tank itself. There was probably 9 gallons below in the sump area, so we're probably somewhere around 20, 29 gallons of water. And I put in a drop of iodine, and I look at the tank, and nothing happens. I mean, I'm just like, that's it? That's not enough. So I put in a second drop. And all of a sudden, my clownfish were gasping. They were just losing their minds. And I was just like, what happened? And how do you get iodine out of the water quickly? And I just sat there on the floor looking at my poor little clownfish gasping with no idea what to do. I mean, zero. And I just waited it out with them. It's like I held their fin and it passed. They were okay, but I knew immediately, never make that mistake twice. So don't put 2 drops in a 29 gallon. You know, like I said, 1 drop per 50 gallons. It's kind of hard to cut a drop in half, so you can't really do that. You could use another product, or you could dilute the solution, like put the drop inside something, stir it, and then pour in half. I guess that's half a drop. But don't overdose iodine. That was a mistake I made once, and I didn't make the mistake twice. So I would recommend that. Speaking of dosing things accidentally or too much of, this is another one. I'd say it's a mistake. So it's probably why I talk about this so frequently on this stream, that it's very important that you trickle things into the system, especially in an area of high flow. So for example, you need to dose alkalinity into your tank. And you're trying to bring the number up, which of course brings up the pH as well. And so you look up how much you need. And let's just say your system needs, I don't know, we'll just go with teaspoons again. Let's say we needed 3 teaspoons of baked baking soda, and we mix it up in a cup of water, and then you can just pour that into your tank gradually, right? Well, the point I wanted to make is that one time, you know, I did what I thought I needed, and I read the recipe, and I followed the instructions, and I felt good to go, and I poured it in, and the pH shot up on my tank really, really fast. And nothing bad happened, except all the SPS corals started doing this stress thing where they were sending off tendrils. Just this long slime was coming off all of them, the entire reef, and I thought, wow, what are they doing? Why are they acting like this? And then I look at my pH, and I think it was like 8.6, 8.7, maybe it was 8.9. It was really crazy high. And it was at that moment that I realized, well, I did have the right amount, but because I poured it in the reef, it hadn't really mixed into the system yet to like dissipate. And so the mistake was pouring it in all at once, rather than to add a little bit now and then wait 10 minutes and add a little bit more and wait 10 minutes. And matter of fact, even look at the pH probe and see what's the the reading and see what the pH is now before I add more. So let's say I had a cup and it had 3 teaspoons of solution in it. I could pour in about 1/3 and then wait 10 minutes, look and see what if the tank looks okay, and then resume with another dose, and then finally finish it off if I need it all. And I do that now with almost everything. Rather than using the proper amount, I will use less than what's recommended, and I watch to see the results, see what the numbers are, and then I'm like, oh, it was in fact correct, and I need to put in more, and I get up to that point, and then I test again, and everything is exactly where it needs to be, and that was good. But I didn't risk, the mistake of putting in too much, and now I'm trying to undo that mistake. Like, let's say you were mixing up salt water, and you're trying to correct a deficiency, and you did the math, and you pour it all in, and then you mix it all up, and it sits for, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, and then you test everything, and like magnesium is like crazy high, and you can't possibly use that water now. It's impossible to remove that magnesium from the water to use it. So then you're thinking, do I throw away the barrel? Do I dilute it down? What can I do? Because odds are you don't want to use it the way it is. So if you're using a gradual approach where you add a little bit more, it takes longer, yes, but at least you'll know for a fact you're not making any mistakes. And that way, when you finally test, magnesium will either be where it needs to be, or you still need to add a little bit more. But you can actually judge now how much it needs, rather than before in the first place you were guessing how much you needed and you were unsure, but the recipe said you need this. The reef chemistry calculator is so important. I recommend everyone use it. I use it regularly. It's very, very helpful in finding out what you need when it comes to alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. But then there's calculators for everything else, including even how to figure out salinity levels in your tank, or the deficiency and how much salt you need to bring it back up. So in the case of the pH going crazy high in my tank, it was another one of these things where I just sat on the floor and watched the reef and held my breath, and about 20 minutes later things calmed down and the SPS corals calmed down again. But had I poured in half of what I'd made up and then waited and then put in the other half, there wouldn't have been anything at all, and I wouldn't even have a story to share with you today. So, that's one of those things that I thought should be definitely included on this list. Now, This is another one of those really benign things that you don't think twice about that actually was very close to being a bad mistake. But at the time, I didn't see that it was... One of the things, I tend to think about things in logistics. I'm always trying to avoid Murphy's Law. And so I try to think things through and make sure that nothing bad is going to happen based on what I'm about to do. And sometimes that's why it takes so long for me to get something accomplished, because I'm being too cautious, or I'm not really comfortable with it yet, and I want to get there, but I'm just not going to jump in with both feet. So this one time, I didn't think of the logistics, is my point. I just was doing my thing. So I'm cleaning my 29-gallon aquarium. I'm standing on a chair, because that tank was up on a tall stand. And I was pulling out empty snail shells. I was pulling out, little bits of broken coral. I was just doing general cleaning. But at the time when I was standing on the chair above the tank, my arms are wet, I realized I didn't bring a bowl or a bucket or anything to put the stuff on. And my tank, it had that little plastic trim, but there was nowhere to put anything. And I just was like, all right, what do I do with this stuff? And so I put it in the overflow box. And the kind of overflow box I had was a hang on back. It's called a weir. And the water goes through the weir and up over the wall of the tank and then drains down to the sump. And inside the weir box, there was a bulkhead with an elbow that had a 90-degree and a piece of tubing that snaked down inside the pipe to make it quiet. So basically water's pouring into the elbow and then goes down the drain to the sump. And I'm throwing these empty things into the overflow box just so I have somewhere to put them, and my intention is to remove these things and throw them away. But I did not. I put them in there and I don't know what happened, but I just didn't remove them all. So what happened over time, because I feel like it definitely was that night when I realized what I'd done wrong. I heard this drip sound from my aquarium. We can hear anything from 50 feet away when we're really in tune with our tanks. And I heard this drip. I'm like, what is that sound? My tank is not leaking, is it? And so I run over there, and the tank is filled to the brim. I mean, it is literally, that's why it's dripping. It's so close to top that it's like one little drop goes off the side, and then it would drip down onto something electronic, of course. I had a UPS on the floor that my Mag 5 pump was plugged into. So if there was a power outage, the Mag 5 would keep going for several hours. And it was running down the side of the tank, and then it would drip down on the UPS. So it didn't cause a fire, nothing like that happened, but I was like, why is my tank overflowing? And of course I look at the weir, and the weir looks normal, except it's really full. And that's when I look on the outside of the weir, through the side of the box, and I see the 90-degree hole that is the elbow going down, and there's a turbo snail right against it like a cork. So the empty shell had basically, over a period of time, worked its way closer and closer until it sucked right onto it. And at that point, the tank filled up, the return zone of the sump sucked down enough that it wasn't quite enough to create a massive cascading overflow, because it was a small sump under a small tank, but it was enough to fill it to the brim and plus a little tiny bit more. So the tank could not drain, so the tank fills more and more, and I caught the drip, I removed the snail shell. So I learned to never put anything in the overflow box, because I could have ended up with a big mess. It could have been an electrical problem. As the water was dripping on the UPS, had the UPS tripped the circuit, it would have killed power to the entire area, and I might have slept through the whole thing. So I was lucky that I heard the drip, and I caught my mistake, and I learned from my mistake to never put anything that could potentially block the drain line going down into the sump. So hopefully there will be another one of those stories that helps you in some regard. I realize, all of our situations are different. We don't set up exactly the same way. So you may not encounter that exact scenario, but you might have thought about throwing things in the overflow box in the past, or put them on top and then they fall in. So don't do that. All right. Did that one. I'm running out of list. It's going so well. Okay. So sometimes you're away from your tank and you have to do things remotely. And I was at Mackinac, let's say 10 years ago. No, couldn't have been that. Well, yeah, it could be. Somewhere, let's say 8 years ago. And I was somewhere, maybe I was Chicago, I don't know where I was. And I was getting notifications from my Apex saying that the waste collector on my protein skimmer was full. And the problem with that notification, I mean, it's a good thing. You want to be told that so you can go empty it so that the skimmer will turn back on. That's the whole point of why I have it set up that way. The problem, or the thing I don't like, and I still haven't found a workaround, and I'm sure there's a workaround, but I haven't figured it out, is that once you get that notification, you will get that same warning message every hour on the hour until you solve the problem. And I'm in Chicago. So what do I do is and the first notification's at 2 in the morning, of course. So I'm not going to call my tank sitter and say, hey, my waste collector's full. Can you run over there? So, I end up going to bed. I put my phone on silent. And when I wake up, it's like text, 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 text. And they all just say the exact same thing. And I'm thinking, oh, God. So I went, this was Friday morning. It was the Neptune meetup, which is a thing they do for Apex users Friday morning before Machina starts. And I'm in that room, and there's a lot of us control freaks are all in there talking. And I told one of them, I said, man, I'm getting all these stupid notifications. I'm not going to be home for 3 more days. I don't know when my tank sitter is going to go over there and empty this thing out. But as soon as he does, this is going to stop. And they said, well, you could just turn off that float switch. Because here's the thing about the notification alarm system with the Apex. If you have an alarm of any kind happening currently, then anything else going wrong with your tank, you will not get an alarm because it's busy with this alarm. So that's why we clear an alarm, so if something else comes up, a new alarm can come up. And so in the case of this situation, I thought, well, I don't want to turn off alarms because what if the tank gets too hot? What if the pH gets too low? What if, I don't know. So they said, why don't you just turn off that float switch so it'll quit sending a signal? And I thought, oh, that's a great idea. So I turned off the float switch to the waste collector so it would quit alarming me. But what I did not know when I did that at that time, and now looking back in hindsight, I should have thought about that really hard before I did it. But what it did was it told the protein skimmer, the waste collector's empty, resume skimming. So the skimmer turned back on, and I guess for whatever reason, maybe we had a weather change here happening. The barometric pressure changes and makes skimmers overflow. So maybe we had a weather change, a storm was in town or something. I don't know. I was in Chicago. And the skimmer proceeded to overflow more. And now the waste collector is overflowing and it's flooding into the fish room. But I have the big French drain, so it just goes to the French drain and gets out of my house. It's no problem. However, it kind of kept doing this for, I'd say, all 3 days. It went on for a long, long, long time because, then the person that did come over to check on the tank, he was my normal tank sitter. And that leads to my other mistake. But, so he came, and I said, hey, the waste collector's overflowing. And he says, yeah, I saw that. I went ahead and emptied it out. I'm like, okay, thanks. And he said, it's a big mess. And I thought, well, how bad could it be? Because it's right by the French drain. I mean, it literally has to go 2 feet. And he was like, okay. But that's all he did. He threw some water, He threw some food in the tank. He dumped out the waste collector, and he let me know that it was a big mess in there. And I thought, okay. Well, Sunday evening, a couple days later, so I think this went on for probably about 3 days, and I had no alarms at this point, no alerts because I turned off that float switch. It was the only thing that went wrong. And when I got home, I came home Sunday as soon as Machina was over. And I was probably home by about 11, 12 o'clock at night. And I walk in, and I immediately look at the reef, and the lights were, I think they were off, or maybe it was, that part right before the lights turned off. I had just a little bit of a blue glow. And I walk into the room, and there's water everywhere. And I'm thinking, what the heck? Why would there be this much water? The waste collector's not even full. And that's when I realized what had happened was because I had that switch off. So I explained all that to you guys. Anyway, now I have this giant mess. I literally spent 2 hours cleaning up the fish room and getting everything back the way it needed to be before I went back into the front door and picked up my luggage and brought it into the house to deal with laundry and everything else. But as soon as I walked in the door, I had to fix this giant mess because I turned off the switch inside the waste collector and didn't re-enable it, and it became this ongoing geyser. And remember I said that was my other mistake? By bringing in someone else to watch my tank than my normal tank sitter, he wasn't as familiar with it. And even though he had a tank and an Apex and, he had a beautiful reef, he did not have the desire to investigate the situation. He just reported to me there was a problem and went on with his life. And that really bothered me. And because when I go take care of someone's tank for them, I treat it like it's my own. I'm cleaning the glass. If there's a pump that's disgusting, I clean it. I'm underneath looking at situations. Is there something I can correct? Is there anything that's amiss? Is there anything that needs to be addressed, or should I at least let them know about? That kind of thing. And in this case, the person that was watching, he did his literal, the saying, it's the least I could do? It literally was the least he could do. And it was a big mistake. And I'd never used him again because I was so frustrated with that situation. And that's where you learn from your mistakes. So having a great tank sitter is really good. The one I've got is awesome. He has helped me with many, many projects on this house. He's helped me with my aquarium in the past. And he's solved problems that I didn't know were a problem. And got it fixed. It was amazing. So I'm super glad I have him as a second pair of eyes when I am out of town. And so it is good to have a great person that's either really wise or that you can teach them enough that they are comfortable to really be in tune with your tank when you're away. All right. So I talked about that and that and that. All right, and then finally, my worst story involves death. And I've shared this a couple of times, but if you're new to the channel, you haven't heard it, you might as well hear it because it's an important one to know. So on the top of my tank, there's a rim where I can put something down. It's called Euro bracing. And I used to have some sun corals down low in the tank. It was in my previous tank. It was in my 280-gallon reef. And every night I'd feed the sun corals. And the way you feed the sun corals is you turn off all the pumps in the tank, and then you would take your frozen food that you thawed out, and with a pipette, you reach your arm down in there, and you squirt mysis on each one of the little polyps, and they close up like little anemones, and they eat it, and 5 minutes later they're open, and you feed them again, and they close, and 5 minutes later you do it again. So you feed them about 3-4 times, and then you turn on your pumps again. And I'd been doing this for years. I didn't do it every day. I'd probably do it 3 times a week. And one night I melted my fish food in the little bowl sitting on the top. I stopped all the pumps in the tank, and I went to go brush my teeth or something. And I guess I turned off the TV, and for some reason in my brain, and when I say turn off the pumps, I mean I turned off all the pumps. Because if you're trying to feed a coral frozen food, you're trying to target feed a specific polyp, and you have flow moving through the tank, it's just going to blow the food elsewhere. So, and the reason I did it late at night was because I wanted to do it when the fish were asleep. I didn't want the fish to to steal the food and compete with this coral. I wanted to feed that coral, and I always did it at night with a flashlight. And I would go ahead and I'd set it on top of the rim, shining down, and I could see what I'm doing. I'd feed the polyps, and then it's done. Resume the pumps. But whatever happened, I forgot that I was about to feed these corals, and I just went to bed. And the tank was off all night long. I mean, completely off. My fault because I turned it off. And when I got up the next day, I woke up because someone was coming over. And so when I walked in toward the reef, the water line was down to about here because it had drained down when the power was off. And I'm looking at the tank, it's like, oh, I forgot to turn the pump back on. That was stupid. But I went and answered the door, and then I went behind to flip on the switch to turn on the pump. And he says, why are all your fish lying on the sand? And I said, that's funny, ha ha, whatever. And I came around the front, and all my fish were lying on the sand. And I was just devastated because I knew immediately what had happened. It wasn't just the return pump was off, every pump was off. I made a terrible mistake, and when I looked up, there was the fish food still sitting there with a pipette. And I just started, of course I got the pumps going, and I started looking at these fish, and I was, and I'm looking at Spock, and she was nose down in the sand, but still alive. But her mouth was in the sand, and she was at a 45-degree angle, and I was like, oh my God. So I reached in and I basically lifted her a little bit to get her up, toward the flow of the pumps, and because they always say get water flowing across their gills. And She, of course, swam away from me because she was freaking out. And I think she was temporarily blinded, just due to oxygen deprivation, because she started slamming into one coral after another like a bulldozer. She was like, pow, and then pow, and then pow. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, it's bad enough what I did, but when she's done, I'm not going to have any corals left either. And I was looking at the corals themselves, and during this power, with the power being off, for all these hours, interestingly, it was just one of those weird things I caught in the corner of my eye. All the polyps were like super extended and wide open and gorgeous. I mean, it was like those corals were like, yes! It wasn't like they were dying of starvation. They weren't pale or anything like that. They just looked wide open like they were in feeding mode. So anyway, I'm watching Spock. I'm trying to, get her near a power head, like in front of the vortex so the flow can go across her head. And at the same time, I'm reaching the tank and I'm pulling out one dead fish after another. And I probably lost about 9 fish that night. And all these fish were vivid, they were healthy, they were fat. As I would take them out and hold them in my hand, I finally realized just how big they were. Because we see them swimming and we don't really get a sense of scale. We really don't. You put something adorable that you got from the fish store in your tank and it grows over the years, and you look at it and it's your pet. And then one day, when the thing jumped out of the tank or when you have to move it, you're actually like, wow, this thing's actually big. I didn't realize how much you've grown since I got you. And so I'm pulling out these fish, and the powder blue tang was beautiful. It was perfect. It wasn't picked clean by cleanup crew. It still had the eyes. It looked like it was awake. It just wasn't breathing. And I couldn't do anything to make these guys come back to life. I mean, there was nothing. I feel like they probably all started dying within about 20 minutes of me, finding out what happened, because they still were so vividly colorful. Pulled out a great, well-behaved flame angel that was gone. I lost a very healthy copper band. I'm trying to think what else I lost in that one, but my Spock survived it. The purple tang crown royal survived it. The clownfish survived it. They were very hardy. Long-nosed hawkfish survived it. I think I lost a different type of hawkfish in that one. It was just really devastating to see all these beautiful fish that were gone because of my stupid mistake. And it was my worst mistake in 23 years of being in the hobby. And it's completely preventable. At the very least, if you have some kind of a controller, or even if you use a mechanical timer. I've talked about using mechanical timers many times, and I don't know how many of you guys do it, but that's the kind with the wheel on the front, and there's like all these little plastic things, or they have switches that you push in and out. If you ever want to turn something off temporarily, like you want it off, but you don't want to forget to turn it back on later, you could set up a mechanical timer with the buttons all set to on. Like every 2 hours, it's going to be on. And that way, when you need to turn something off, you switch the thing to off, and that thing is off, but in 2 hours, it's going to come on no matter what. And if I had done some kind of code in my Apex that after this amount of time, restart these pumps, I wouldn't have lost my fish. Even if I had not turned on the return pump, if at least the inflow, the pumps in the tank creating the in-tank flow had been on, everything would have survived. But because I turned off everything to stop any kind of movement in the water so I could feed those sun corals, I lost a bunch of really important fish to me, and I was really devastated. It was really hard to deal with that one, and it was completely my fault. There was no one else to blame. It was just a horrible thing, and it took a while to get over that one. I was really, really, really frustrated, but never made that mistake twice. And that's the point of this episode. Is like we want to watch out for, well, if that happened to him, how can I avoid that? What can I do to make sure it never happens to what happened to that person? And that's one of the reasons why I spent so much time on the forums back in the early 2000s. I was on those things daily, reading story after story, DIY experience after DIY experience, overdose mistakes and kalkwasser crashes and all these things. And I kept reading to learn as much as I possibly could to avoid having the same thing happen to me. And that is probably one of the reasons you guys tune into this stream, because you want to know what you can do, what you shouldn't do, what to avoid, what's a good idea, maybe what's not such a good idea. And by having these conversations, it helps it rounds you out as a reef keeper for better husbandry, and hopefully you won't have to endure those types of mistakes. Now, I gotta say, and I've said this before, and people have told me, oh my God, now that you said it, you know, it's bad, bad luck. I've been lucky in that I've never had a crash in all the years I've been reef keeping. Even that night when I lost some fish, that wasn't a crash. A crash is absolute devastation. You lose everything you own. And I've never had that happen with any of my tanks. And part of it is because of logistics. I look at the situation and I try to anticipate what could go wrong, and I try to set up fail-safes as best I can. I mean, certain things I cannot control, but I can try to outwit as many of the bad things that could happen. And so I spent a lot of time thinking and analyzing and trying to anticipate where I can fill a niche so that it will end up working out well no matter what. So that's kind of my topic for today, and I don't really have a lot more on that. I didn't come up with any other ideas, by the way, no other stories. But I will share one story. My friend Jerry, he's got his reef tank in his living room, and last year he installed the sump in the basement. And you know, I've never done that. I live on a slab foundation. My choice is the sump goes under the tank or it goes behind the tank. But I can't go down because it's solid concrete, and under that is limestone and earth, and you know, that's it. So he called me up and he just wanted to visit, but when I called him back, he told me, you know, that his basement was full of water. So of course I'm wondering, did his river flood the basement? And he says, no, 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 it's my tank. And it was the waste collector and the top off and everything combined, everything went wrong. So he was, you know, wanting to know what should he do first. And I said, well, the first thing we want to do is fix your salinity. And that was exactly what had gone wrong, is that with everything going wrong, his top off had drained all the water into the sump, trying to keep up with all the water being lost on the floor. And his salinity was down to 1.020 when it had just been at 1.026. And because of the way the series of events happened, he ended up with, he had no salt water, he had no fresh water. I mean, his barrels were all run dry. It was a bad scenario. So I logged into his Apex Fusion, and I started looking at what he had going on, trying to figure out what had happened, trying to understand why his switches didn't kick in. And at the same time, I had this calculator open on my desktop that I was going to use for myself to figure out how much more salt you need to add to reach a certain level, because I had this project I was going to do. But since the calculator was open, I said, tell me your total water volume. And I entered it, and I said, you know, your salinity is 1.020. And he said, yes. And I said, well, you want it to be 1.026? And he said, yes. And so I plugged it in, and it said you need 14 pounds of salt to bring this back up. And he said, well, how much is that in cups? So I went back to Google, and I typed it in, and I said, well, it seems to be right around 23 cups of salt. And he was like, well, I don't have any water at this point. What am I going to do? And so that's when I told him, well, I've read, because I've never done this, I've read how some people will take salt and they will put it directly in the sump and let it melt in the water to raise salinity. And I said, look, that's dangerous. There is a risk to doing that. I know some people do it. It's not a normal thing people do, but some people do it. The risk is the salt crystals, if they don't just land at the bottom of the sump and they move through the sump and through the return pump, go into the tank, they hit the gills of the fish and it burns them. The salt crystals land on the corals and it burns them. I mean, it's caustic stuff until it's dissolved. And so I said, here's what I would recommend you do. And we were on FaceTime. And I said, I want you to put in a power head inside your sump somewhere. And I want you to put in 2 cups of salt and then set a timer on your watch for 5 minutes. And let that power head mix up that salt, and that way we aren't putting in 23 cups of salt in your sump. So he did. He put in the 2 cups. I said, what does the water look like? And he said, it looks clear. It doesn't look weird. And I was like, okay. Just put in the 2 cups, do the power head, set the timer. And then, you know, we would talk about other things. He was starting to investigate the protein skimmer. And then the timer went off on his watch, and he put in 2 more cups. And every time he put in a cup of salt, I wrote down a little line, you know how you do when you're counting. And so I did all these tick marks on a piece of paper right next to me so I could say, you're up to 8 cups now. We know where you are, because it's so easy, especially spreading out over time, forgetting where you left off. And he sat basically next to the sump, and he was rerouting things. I was correcting what I felt was wrong on his Apex Fusion control panel and kind of organizing it and removing things that no longer existed and correcting some code. And we determined that at least one of his float switches was actually acting backwards than the way it was designed, because A float switch is wired with electricity, low voltage, but it's still a little bit of electricity, and the switch drops, and then when water lifts the switch up, it makes contact and it closes the circuit, which then in turn the apex says, okay, this circuit is now closed, I should do such and such. Well, his switch was basically wrong, and the way to correct it is you take the clip off the bottom, you remove the float, and you just go ahead and turn it over and then put it back on and put the clip back in place. And if you operate this way, you can correct a switch that's not wired backwards, but the polarity is reversed. So to correct one that doesn't work in the way you expect it to work, you just remove the clip, take the thing off, flip it over, put it on, put the clip back on. It's real easy. It takes 30 seconds. The thing was, because his switch was working backwards, he programmed it in the opposite way you normally would, and somehow it was working until it didn't. And that's what I was doing. I was helping him figure that all out. And during the time of basically 55 minutes, he was able to bring salinity up to 1.026 with no ill effects to his tank. So it was really good that it worked out that way, because he gradually added 2 cups every 5 minutes for the entire hour. He says, actually, that wasn't bad. Because he was saying, I guess I'll go upstairs and I'll go out on the patio and smoke a cigar. And I was like, no, you won't. 5 minutes is fast. You'd be surprised. And he was like, man, it's time to put 2 more cups in. And so we had, it was a nice thing, and we rescued his reef. And it wasn't really overwhelming. It just was a gradual approach. That, like I said, getting the salinity back on track within an hour's time was the best thing he could possibly do. And then, of course, resolve the other issues with these float switches and the waste collector and the protein skimmer. And I just talked with him, I think yesterday, and I asked him, how things are going. He says, everything's pretty much good. So I'm really glad we caught it when we did, and we could correct it without overcorrecting it and causing more issues down the road. So there you go. And it just comes down to how much gear you've got hooked up. Because you can add more sensors, you can add more floats, you can add, all these things. You can put timers in there and defer commands, and you can really complicate your code to do some really amazing stuff. But in his situation, because it's down in the basement, it's out of sight, you don't even know what's happening until you go look. Where if it had been in his living room, he would have seen water on the floor, and you're like, what's going on? He would have handled it. But that's kind of the downside. So I was saying it might be good to put yourself some webcams that point down into the basement or point down near the sump or something, so that way you get a notification. As a matter of fact, I set up some notifications also, because his alarm code was literally, if the temperature's this or if the temperature's this, send me a message. And that was the only alarm he had. So now he could have an alarm like if the floor is wet, he can have an alarm. If the waste collector's full, he can have an alarm. I don't know. I've got like 19 alarms on mine. So I always have something notifying me if there's something wrong. And most of them never happen. But at least the code is there in case there is a need for it to happen. All right. I want to change topics here for a moment. I want to talk about nitrate. Not my favorite topic, but it is what it is. So I have been battling nitrates now with different approaches for several years. And I had a reason for why I was doing it the way I was doing it. And basically, I'm trying to see if product X can solve nitrate like it says it can. And then if product X didn't work, then I would do product Y. And I would give product Y a chance to work on it. And I'd give it 6-8 months trying to make it work. And then finally, I'd try product Z. But I had an epiphany a week ago. And because it's been strange, my nitrates have continued to go up. And they shouldn't have, especially with these different products. I mean, at the very least, they should hold them steady. But they've been going up. And I didn't know why. And, some of my friends are like, well, you never change water. Or your sand bed is old. Yes, you're right. But if product X can remove the nitrate, then does a water change physically matter at that point? Because the water change, yes, it will remove nitrate with every batch you change. And if you change 50% of the water, you'll cut the nitrate in half. Boom, just like that. And I haven't ruled that out, by the way. I have thought about doing that several times. I'm a little bit worried that my corals and fish have gotten so used to the level that it's at that if I bring it down rapidly, I feel like I'll lose some corals. I might even lose a fish, just because, you know, it's a big change really fast, and we want gradual. Like I said, with him adding salt every 5 minutes, it gradually brought the salinity up over an hour's time. So anyway, my epiphany was kind of I didn't think about this until just now, but I would say about 6 months ago, my protein skimmer has not been pulling out as much skimmate as it had in the past. It used to pull out, you know, whatever it pulled out. And, you know, from time to time, my waste collector would be full. I get a notification, the skimmer is off, waste collector's full. I go dump it out and resume. And I'd say for about 6 months now, my protein skimmer has only pulled out a little bit of solution. You know, I have a waste collector that's about this big around. And it has about this much skimmate in it all the time. Which means none is going in there. And I thought, man, I'm not really pulling out much like I used to. In the old days, I was dumping that out once, twice, 3 times a week, something like that, and it would hold like 1.5 gallons. And it occurred to me that also in the last 6 months, I've noticed that my phosphates have been going up a little bit more rapidly than I've ever experienced. And I kept thinking, yeah, the tank is old, the sand bed, the lack of water changes, you know, the obvious things. But the fact that the protein skimmer isn't pulling anything out like it should, that didn't dawn on me until last week. I don't know why. I mean, everything's automated. Everything's set up to work correctly. It's working. There's bubbles in it. The waste collector is collecting some skimmate, but it wasn't collecting very much. And so I tried to increase the water level in the protein skimmer to make it skim wetter. And by wetter, that means that there's more water being dumped into the cup. Or, you know, in my case, they would drain from the cup into the waste collector. And so I wanted to have more skimmate come out, even if it's watery, just so it's being more efficient. But as I've been trying to adjust it to be wetter and wetter, it really wasn't getting wetter and wetter. And I just thought, this is so strange. And so when I was placing an order with Ecotech recently, I went ahead and said, I need you to send me 2 new pumps for my skimmer. I've had it for several years. Maybe these pumps are just worn out. Maybe they're tired. Because I did a deep cleaning about 6-8 months ago. So, you know, in theory, everything's clean and operational within there, even though it's had time since then. But, so I've got 2 pumps that are going to arrive any day. And then I'll do another deep cleaning and I'll swap out the pumps. And I'll probably get finer bubbles in the body of the skimmer and it'll be pulling out more stuff. But in the meantime, I've really closed the output valve of my protein skimmer to dump out more skimmate. And I posted a picture on Instagram and Facebook last night, and it showed a whole bunch. And I put a comment like, you know, here's the nitrate. And I cleaned it all out. I cleaned the protein skimmer collection cup today. And matter of fact, I could show you that, I think. Let me see if I can set this camera up. Give me a second here. So we'll do this first of all. Hopefully that'll help. And we want to use this. My wire is kind of short, so I don't have a lot of choice here for you guys today, but let's see if I can zoom in. Okay, good. Oh, that's really zoomed in. All right, so now let me just lock this in place so it doesn't fall. We'll switch cameras. So you can see the protein skimmer right now. It's bubbling way, way up in the cup, and I've got the biggest bubbles happening at the top, but I mean the water line is much higher inside the body of the skimmer than it's ever been. And I think with the newer pumps, it will actually have a better foam head, and I can put the water level at the normal level within the body of the skimmer. But I think that by really exporting a lot of solution for the next few weeks, I'm going to see the decrease that I was expecting when it regards to nitrate coming out of the system, because the water changes haven't really made it budge. And I expected at least some kind of change, and I saw nothing. But everything else, every other water parameter has been really solid, and I'm very pleased with that. So now, like someone just said here, you got to watch your salinity, and I'm definitely going to watch it, and that's the next thing I want to tell you about. So let me switch the camera back here. All right, so Mike, one of my moderators from Club Milo's Reef, he sent me a ginormous hydrometer. And so he loves this thing. He says it's the most accurate thing on the planet. And I was like, okay, cool. So I'll show you guys what this thing looks like. You've seen smaller versions of this. And this is made by Tropic Marin. Like I said, Mike just swears by this thing. So it is a humongous hydrometer. And I keep feeling I'm going to break it. I mean, they're made of glass. Of course I'm going to break it. I'm trying not to. So I tried putting this anywhere in my system, and the only place I could put it is the tank because it needs to go in the water so deeply. I tried a couple of things where I would take a barrel and fill it up with salt water and then stick it in the barrel. And not barrel, a bucket. But I had to put in like 4 gallons of water in there to make a measurement. I thought, oh. So I said, all right, Mark, what can you do? So yesterday, I went into my workshop and I noticed leaning against the wall, I had some tubing. And I was like, huh, I could do something with that. So I made this guy right here. So this is my new salinity tester. Now, I already have refractometers. You know that. And I can use those. But Mike is swearing by this thing. And since he gifted it to me, I got to use it. And so I've got this. And I checked it out yesterday. I put it in. I filled it up with water to about here, which, by the way, is half a liter for those metric people that are watching the show. And to the top is 1 liter. But if I fill it to halfway and then I put the hydrometer in there, it will let me measure right through here, and I can see perfectly the meniscus, and I can see exactly where it lands on the scale. But I've put a rubber band here because that's around 750 milliliters. And if I do that, I can reach in to remove it when it's done. Because if it's sitting too far down inside, it's hard to retrieve. And again, it's fragile and I don't want to break it. So I made this little thing for myself. I used a 3/8 piece of scrap acrylic. This was actually a cutout from something where you put your hand through it. So I had this scrap, I rounded over the edges. I glued the tube on there, and I hate working with round material. You guys know I have a rule. And I sanded the edge as best I could, and then I was cleaning the edge. And when I just used my regular solvent to clean, it actually got a bunch of tiny little cracks. And I was like, ugh. Again, never work with round stuff. I glued it together. I tested last night. It worked out. Salinity on the reef right now appears to... Now, I didn't check the calibration of that yet, okay? That's the thing I have to do today. But just taking it and putting in tank water, it seems like my tank is around 1.028 with that hydrometer. With my refractometer, I'm about 1.027. So if I do a really watery skimmate at this point, I can actually get away with losing some salt water and having top-off water bring it down a little bit to get me closer to that 1.026. So I'm hoping I will remove some nitrate daily. I will get my salinity back down where it needs to be because I didn't realize it had risen to that point. And because, I mean, I measure it all the time, but it's always like, it's around 1.026. You know, you look through the thing and you're trying to use this thing and be really accurate. Now, to do a test with this guy, I need at least 2 bottles of accuracy, the calibration solution, to have enough to actually verify it, that it'll measure 1.0265 or 35 ppt. So that is one of my things to do today, as well as to do all my tests. So I'll be testing all my normal things that I do every Saturday. And I highly recommend on Water Test Saturday that you test your water because you're supposed to. It's really important. One last thing about testing I wanted to bring up because I hear it a lot. I know everyone's got a preference for test kits. And I understand that, and I respect it. I myself have used a lot of different test kits over the years. In the beginning, I used API because that's what the fish store had. Then later on, I went to Salifert, and I used that for a very long time. I tried out Red Sea briefly, didn't really like it. And then somehow I got my hands on Elos. I think I won them in a contest on Facebook. And once I started using them, I never looked back. I really like the Elos test kits. But whatever test kit you own, you need to use it. And if you're just buying them and not using them, you're killing your own reef. you're working against yourself. So when you buy a kit to measure alkalinity, that's a 1-year kit. And it probably will test your water 50 times in a year, and the kit will be empty. And it should not be a 2 or 3 year kit. So make sure when you get your kit that you actually use the thing every week and find out what the numbers are. And I want to talk about nitrate because this is the Salifert kit and this is the API kit. And this is the one people are like, oh, why would you ever use API? API is garbage. Well, my API kit is measuring my nitrate about 80 when I tested last week. And when I pulled out the Salifert kit, it measured about 80. So they actually match. So I wouldn't quite throw under the bus this brand just because there are some of their tests that you don't like. There is nothing wrong with measuring ammonia with API or nitrite with API. Nitrate. Any of those can be done with API. I've never actually bothered to try their calcium or their alkalinity tests. I've just not done it. But I would say for the basic test, there's nothing wrong with using that kit. So if you want that, especially if you're testing it all the time and it's just too expensive to keep buying a high dollar kit, I have no qualms recommending nitrate or ammonia with API, and I continue to use it. But like I said, I pulled out this kit. This kit here was brand new, and yet it shows, I bought it a while back, never opened it. I was going to do a video and never used it. It shows that the expiration date is 04/2020. So technically it's already out of date, and I've only used it twice. So I kind of lost my money on that one. But we want to use our kits, and we want to verify. And it's really important to double check your kits from time to time to make sure the numbers you're getting are accurate. That's why I got the extra kit, so I could verify it against another one and see if the numbers are close to each other or if they're completely different. Because that way you know how your tank is doing. And if you don't want to buy extra kits for that purpose of verifying, you can get someone else with their kits to try to test your water and compare their numbers to your numbers of the same water sample. And if you don't have a buddy with test kits, you can always ask your fish store if they'll test your water. And they may say, yes, we'll be happy to do it, and there's a fee. So you pay the fee. What are they going to charge you, like $15, $18 to measure all your water parameters? I think that's a good price. And of course, there's ICP testing too. But it doesn't quite test everything the way we're used to testing. The numbers are a little bit more complicated, and there's a lot more elements involved there. But for the big numbers that we care about the most, it's always good to double check and see that your readings are accurate. Okay, now I want to start answering your questions. We are about almost an hour into this stream, and I want to remind you guys that during this part of the show, if you ask a question, please put @MeLovesReef so I can find your questions, because I'm scrolling through a long chat here trying to see where you asked me something. And a lot of times you guys talk to each other, and so it's a really hard time for me to find those questions. So, oh, I want to try something really quick here. So I'm going to reuse another old video because it's the only thing I've got handy. So we'll take this thing, and I want to try this. Hey, I kind of don't hate that. So if we put that there, now I can talk to you. I can answer questions. We'll move it up a little bit higher. But now you get a little video there because the reef behind me is blurry on a webcam. So having some nice video on there I think would be nice. And let me throw a question on here. Let me just throw this on here. I just want to see where the word lands. Perfect. We'll put it right there. Alrighty. Hello, Kay Miller. See, I didn't ignore you. It just took me an hour to get to your comment. Let's go with this one. He didn't say Admila's Reef, but I'm just going to go with it. Ezekiel, interesting way of spelling that, huh? Says, I'm downsizing my reef from a 180 to a 120. Yeah, from 180 to a 120. My skimmer is the Regal internal 250. Is it going to overskim, or should I downsize? I think for now, try it out and see how it operates. It definitely is double the size of your tank. I mean, the INT 250 is basically considered the skimmer for a 250-gallon system. And since you're doing a 120, you're like half of it. Just try it out initially and see how it operates. If it works out fine, you can keep using it. You could even feed a little heavier because you got this super skimmer doing its job under your tank. Hopefully, it will fit inside the sump of the smaller tank. A 120 and a 180 usually are about the same width front to back. So in theory, if your sump is relatively the same size, you should be able to use it. Let's see. Krista says, I really enjoyed watching the live talks and have recently joined the Facebook page. Love learning. That's good, Krista. That's how it's supposed to be. Here we go. Alex says, thank you very much for the super chat, first of all. He says, I have a 45-gallon soft coral tank. Do you think kalkwasser dosing is more cost-effective than two-part dosing? Can I use kalkwasser in an ATO? First of all, yes, it is definitely more cost effective than two-part because kalkwasser is cheap. It is, all it is it's pickling lime, which you can be found at Walmart and or Amazon, and you can mix it with your top-off water. And the general recipe is a tablespoon per gallon, and you want to mix it up, and you want it to turn clear, and then you want to take that clear liquid and put that in your top-off container. And that way there's no sediment and there's none of that skin on the top. You don't want any of that to ever get in your reef. You want the liquid in between. And people used to use kalkwasser as their top-off to maintain alkaline and calcium, and it also helped to fight off phosphates, which was a benefit as well. It was a very inexpensive way of dosing or maintaining. Now, if your numbers are out of sync, if your alkalinity is really high or your calcium is really low, it can't fix that. You've got to get the number back where it belongs, and then kalkwasser will maintain it. The downside of dosing kalkwasser with the top-off system is when your evaporation rate changes based on seasonal conditions, based on how much humidity is in the air. If your tank is only topping off 1 gallon of water for X amount of months, and then suddenly it's only topping off half a gallon of water, or there might be a few weeks where it's topping off 2 gallons of water, see how you're putting in way more kalkwasser or way less. And so you're having to constantly make adjustments to keep up, or you're having to pour it in to make up for the lack thereof. But it can be done. I personally don't use kalkwasser, and I don't know that you need it with a soft tank. Soft corals don't usually have big demands for alkaline and calcium. So you may find softy only that water changes would suffice. You can just top off with top-off water, not even open the can of worms that is kalkwasser. So, I would do some testing and I would see what happens. And if you feel the need, the other thing is, and I've mentioned this before, I really don't like it being the top-off system. And I've told people I'd rather you dose the kalkwasser somehow, one way or another. Maybe some kind of a container you set on the edge of the tank at night, and it trickles in a quart every night. And then your top-off is your top-off. It's just water. It's just RODI. And that way you limit any kind of disaster because you have this quart sitting on your system, whether it's on the sump or it's on the tank itself. And when the quart's empty, it's empty. That's it. Nothing can go wrong. Nothing else. Other than somebody knocking it off the tank, like if you have a cat, that would be bad. But if you could set up a safe system where you put in the exact amount you need, it might only be half a quart. It may not be that much you need. And just that little bit each evening would do the job. That would be the safest bet and the least likelihood of having a disaster that could kill your tank. Because kalkwasser is very caustic stuff. The pH is 12, and if it all goes in the tank at once for whatever reason, it couldn't kill your livestock. The water turns milky white and you can't see anything. A lot of talking here today. Okay, here's one. Glenn says, can I ask you a serious question? Would you ever consider creating a reef aquarium book, consolidating all the needs, requirements, and level boundaries with everything for reef aquariums? I have been playing with the thought of writing a book for the last few years. I would love to have the time to do it. I haven't run into that time. I don't have the downtime that I'm wanting. Really, if I had some free time, I would be editing videos. And I know you guys have been waiting for those, and I have been waiting for those. I really want those to happen, and they haven't. And it's frustrating to me because I have a phone filled with video, and I need it off my phone. I need it on YouTube. And but no, a book has come to mind. I would love to see that happen at some point. Let's see. Sizzle Reef says, I'd like to run an air pump from my garage into my tank to boost the oxygen level. What are the benefits and are there any drawbacks? The air pump itself may not be necessary, but let's just go with that for a moment. You could have an air pump somewhere, outside your home, inside your garage, somewhere where it's getting fresh air is what you're hoping for, and pumping that in. The question is, where do you pump it to? Are you putting an air stone inside your tank? Are you putting an air stone inside the sump? Are you trying to push that fresh air into the protein skimmer? Because if it's the protein skimmer, I have known many people, including myself in the past. I did it for a while. And I thought, no, that's kind of neat, but I didn't really know that it did the job. But I know some people run tubing through the attic to the eaves to draw air in, and they hook the tubing up to the intake venturi tube of the protein skimmer to essentially suck in air from outside, which would help bring the pH in the tank a little higher. And that can work, but it wasn't such a big change that I thought, okay, I got to keep doing that. I did it for a while with my 280-gallon reef. I ran the tubing through the attic, and I came out the eave with it. And I kept thinking, well, what if a bug goes into the tube and uses it as a home, or if a wasp decides to make a nest on it? So I had to always look up and make sure the tubes weren't obstructed. But I do kind of like the idea, and I do think it's possible. I don't know that putting an air pump to force air, pump it into the skimmer, will cooperate properly. You'll have to test that out and see what happens. Downside is you're going to hear a pump every time you're out in your garage. Also, the garage air may not be conducive for your reef tank, because of fumes. So you have to consider what's in the garage. Is it going to be a problem? Is it going to be the exhaust from the car? Is it going to be oils and paints and thinners and stains and varnishes and whatever projects you're doing there? Would that be sucked into the pump and then sent into your reef tank or not? But if it's just basically clean air, there really shouldn't be a downside, other than you might see some tubing going from here to there. But you could definitely give it a try and see how it operates, see if it makes a difference. Maybe set it up in a simple way first, just to kind of get a visual and see how you feel about it. And then if it works great, then really clean it all up and make it look sharp. Bodhisattva says, don't you get low salinity from the top off when your skimmer is overflowing? Yes, when a skimmer overflows nonstop, it adds a lot of water, but that's I think we're referring back to my disaster when it was flooding the fish room. And you know what? Any water on the floor looks like a lot. So it probably wasn't, tens of gallons of water, but even 5 gallons of water across my fish room looks like a giant mess. But my top off was replacing whatever was being lost. Like I said, water was everywhere. But my salinity didn't drop much because I had such a big system. Also, my top off container isn't so big that even if and think about this. I set up the top off container full of water, hooked it up, and I went out of town. So it used some of the top off water anyway, like it's supposed to. And so now there's less remaining in the container. And then when the protein skimmer started acting up and the waste collector was sending me notifications, that was 12 hours where nothing was being topped off because nothing was changing. But then when someone told me at Mac, and I just turn off that switch so the alarm stops, that is when everything went wrong. And so yeah, now water is dumping on the floor and top off was adding, but it wasn't enough to kill my salinity like you might think because I didn't have that much available water left. I definitely used up most of the water in that top off container during that trip, but it probably brought it down to, this is a long time ago, but we could say it probably brought it down to 1.025. So it was just a small little hiccup. Of course, when I got home and I cleaned up my mess, I had to refill the top off container. I had to make sure everything's right, and I got it back on track. But you're right, if a top off runs unfettered, like in Jerry's tank that I was talking about also, where everything's flooding the room and the top off keeps going until it runs out of water, that's when you lower your salinity so badly you have to make changes. Gabe says, can you go over which Prodibio vials you use? I tried to email you through the website. I'm sorry if I didn't answer that. I thought I've caught up with all emails. I use Bioptim, Biodigest, Stronti Plus, and IOD Plus. Those are my 4 I use, and I use those twice a month or every 15 days. And I use the Pro vials, and the Pro vials are rated 250 to 500 gallons. So I put in 1 Pro vial of each in my reef every 15 days. So today is the 11th. That means I did it 6 days ago. And I'll do it again in another 9 days. So that's what I've been using since 2011. Christine says, I would love to have someone close enough to tank sit for me. I'm literally 2 hours away from my reef club. I'm an hour from the closest local fish store. That's not local, and it's terrible. Yeah, or horrible. Yeah, it is. Sometimes you can now, here's a kind of a cool story. Again, I have so many Macna stories, but let's see, I gotta stand in the right spot. There was we were in Florida at a Macna, and there was Yeah, that sounds right. We were in Florida. We were worried about hurricanes, right? And this person was visiting Macna from California, where they don't have hurricanes. So here she's braving a hurricane to come to Macna, which is always in August, and that's always when hurricanes happen. So anyway, there she is at Macna, just enjoying the talks, and she gets probably a voicemail from her neighbor who said there's been a major power outage, and so the entire neighborhood has no power. So what she did was she went across the street and she broke the window, broke into the house, and ran an extension cord from her aquarium all the way back to her house because her side of the street had power or they had a generator. And she said, I didn't want your tank to die, so I ran this extension cord across the street. And I just thought, man, that was really nice. And she says, I know, but I want to give her a key because now I got to fix a window. And I was like, yeah, that's a good point. So having someone nearby that knows about your aquarium could turn into something good. And in this case, they took care of her tank while she was still out of town and ran this cord until the power was restored, and then they removed the cord. And that was a really nice gesture of her neighbor. You know, she broke in to save the reef. But if you could teach someone in your general area about your tank, family member, close friend of some, I mean, somebody has to live near you. If you can kind of get them to learn, then maybe they could be there for you when you need a second hand or when you need to travel. That'd be nice. I know it's hard. That's really hard, but it's possible. Macy's daddy says, with your French drain and overflows, do you have to flush it out occasionally? Oh, and that made me think of a mistake that some people make, so I'm going to write this down really quick so I don't forget. All right. I didn't flush it out, no. Well, I mean, I try occasionally, but it was impossible. Because of the grate on top, I couldn't really like flush it. There was no way to like hose it down because my grates were put down into the concrete when I poured the concrete, and I left them locked in there until last month. Last month was the first time in 10 years where I pried them out of the concrete to clean the drain out of all the crap that built up for the last 10 years. And then I put them back in and they stayed, and I was amazed. I did not expect that. I was thinking that they would be loose now, and whenever I go in there with like a stepladder, there's a chance that the stepladder is going to tilt and I'm going to fall because they're not embedded in the floor. And my thought was, I'm going to pry them out, but very likely I'm going to have to buy silicone, and I'll apply a bead of silicone and then press those grates back in and basically glue them in place to keep me safe. But for now, I haven't noticed any. I mean, some of the little bits of concrete on the edges has been chipping off now because I broke the seal, so to speak. And I'm just going to kind of observe. But worst case, I'll do silicone to like lock them back into place. But cleaning them out very easily is not. It's just the way I made it. It's a DIY drain. It's not like a normal drain. So of course it has the downsides of working with whatever I've got. But other than that, it's done a great job. And when the 400 gallon, the one before this one, leaked, it was peeing out of the tank, and I found the problem at 1 in the morning, and I drained half the water out of the tank to get under the leak, and then I went to bed, and when I got up, the floor was dry in the fish room because it all went to the French drain and went out. It was awesome, so I love that. Now, talking about mistakes people make, I told you guys I thought of one more thing that did happen, that does happen to people. Never happened to me, fortunately. Again, logistics. I just thought it through and realized this is something dangerous. Whenever you do have a power outage that knocks out power to everything, and let's say you have a battery backup that's running your return pump, or let's just say that. If it's running your return pump, then the water's moving from the tank into the overflow box, down into the sump, and pumping back up. So all that water's in circulation and it's all good. But water in reactors that are not moving because that pump is still off, like GFO, biopellets, carbon, I'm trying to think what else people have reactors for. A sulfur denitrator. Any kind of reactor that has water not moving through it will go stagnant. And then when the power is restored, all that toxic soup will start pumping back into your system, and it can hurt your tank. So you always want to drain any kind of reactors. And if, well, I'm going to start with that. Drain those reactors of the water that's in them and let new water go in when the power is restored. That's really important. Now, the other part I was going to say, if you're not running a return pump on a battery backup, let's say you're just running Jabos or Waves or just whatever you can get running, and it's just in-tank flow, but your sump is stagnant, so to speak, the sump might be okay, but the water in the 2 overflow boxes of your reef, most tanks have 2, that water sitting in there, that 5 or 6 gallons that it's holding for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, that is toxic. So you want to drain the overflow boxes of all the water in them that's been sitting stagnant before you restart the pumps. So that one is a really important one to know. Put that in the back of your brain. Try to remember it when you're living through that experience. But that is a big important thing that a lot of people don't think about. They thought, well, my vortex kept running because I have a battery backup, or my ice cap gyres kept running because I have the battery backup, so I'm good to go. But that water sitting stagnant in the overflow boxes could be really toxic to your system and shoot the ammonia up when the power starts running. So now you got power going, but now you got this cascading effect of bad things happening to your tank because of the water that was in the overflow boxes. Now, one thing you can do to avoid that is about once an hour is take a gallon jug, stick it in the sump, scoop out a gallon, pour it in the tank, and let it flow through. And then an hour from now, you do another gallon or 2. And you do this every every hour on the hour for, however long it takes for power to be restored. At least you know none of that water is toxic. But any water sitting in reactors, water sitting inside a protein skimmer, anything that's just not moving, that water could go anoxic and it could be dangerous to your tank. So we want to definitely remove that. All right. John says, I can't afford a generator. Some people can't even run a generator. They aren't allowed to. Have you ever used or seen anyone use your car as a generator by using an inverter? Yes, some people have used power inverters to try and keep things going. It depends on the circumstances. Let's say you have a really bad storm happening outside. I mean, just a real howler, and the water's going sideways. It's going to be really hard for you to run outside, even if you have a poncho on, and hook up the wires to the power inverter and run that cord to an extension cord and run that cord inside the house to run like an air pump or something. It can be done. It'd almost be better if you set that all up in advance before the storm hit. So if you need it, it's available and you can plug something in. But also, you're bringing an extension cord from outside. That means you couldn't close the door or the window all the way. So again, you could have the wind howling in through the gap, and the weather could be coming in a little bit too. So it's kind of a challenge in that regard because you're trying to handle it. But yes, you can use power inverters. You can use computer battery backups. You can use the actual battery backups made for the aquarium industry. These are all ways to keep things running. There's even battery-powered air pumps. And Cobalt, I keep saying I'm going to buy these, and I keep forgetting. Cobalt sells these air pumps that have a USB plug, and they charge themselves up, and they're designed to turn on in the event the power goes out. So it's kind of like a trickle charger babysitter, and this would be great for like a small tank. Let's say you had a nano tank, like a 12-gallon tank, and you have this thing set up near the tank, and it's there, it's not on until the power goes out, and then it just comes on and starts pumping air into the tank. That's a really nice safety net, and I saw, and they're really small, they're colorful. I think they come in different colors maybe. I thought, man, that's really cool because you would definitely have at least one avenue of some kind of, it's really minimal, but it's a little bit of flow in the tank when there's no power whatsoever. Now, you did mention you can't afford a generator. A big one's expensive, but Harbor Freight, for example, sells dirt cheap ones that are small. And that would allow you to run something like a MaxiJet or an air pump with an air stone, for example. These are things that could work. But then I've had people say, I can't even have a generator on my balcony because I'll get in trouble with the landlord for the noise. So there's sometimes when you can't do that at all. So there's a few things that might be possibilities for you. Okay. Heron Aquatics says, what are your thoughts on metal halide bulb, the Kelvin? What's the best for growth and for color? So he asked, what spectrums do we like? So 6500 Kelvin will grow coral really quickly, but the corals will be really brown, and most people don't do that. They used to do it. They used to do it a lot. because they were trying to grow the corals from, they've been taken from the ocean, and they'd stick them under the 6,500 Kelvin light bulb, and they'd grow it super fast. They'd raise the alkalinity, and they'd grow, and then they would take frags of that and put it under a 20,000 Kelvin bulb that's very, very blue, and have them grow under that for about 6-8 weeks to color up, to be pretty, so that they could potentially sell them. A lot of people these days are running 20,000 Kelvin bulbs because of the blue. I mean, right now the tank is blue behind me only because I turned off the metal halides. That's the Reef Bright XHOs happening right now. It's same in the video. It's the same scenario. The reason the room is yellow is because there's a light bulb on the ceiling in that room. But the blue looks really great. It makes everything really pretty, but growth is very slow under blue spectrum. So what I recommend is somewhere between 10,000 Kelvin and 14,000 Kelvin. So in my tank, I have the Reef Bright twin arc bulbs. They have 2 arcs inside this single-ended metal halide bulb. And when you first turn on the light, it's white light. It's a 10K bulb, 10,000 Kelvin. And after an hour and a half, it turns off, and a minute later it turns back on, and now it's 20,000 Kelvin for the next 4.5 hours. And that's how I've been running my lights now for probably the last 7 years or so. And I really like it because it gives my reef about an hour and a half. I'd almost increase that. I'm halfway tempted to go to 2 hours a day of white light and then blue light for the rest of the day. But there's a lot of personal preference, but white light definitely does produce good growth. And oh my goodness, it really helps you identify problems in your tank. And that is something, like I had someone say, hey, I've got this algae in my tank, it's brown. He sent me pictures, and of course the lighting was blue. I said, can you turn on some white light? And he did. He goes, hey, the algae's green. I said, that makes more sense. So having some white light in your tank allows you to see things for what they really are. And if you can't change the light to white for some reason, a flashlight will do a good job too. Or taking a picture with a camera with a flash, so you can actually see what's happening in the tank and know what you're dealing with. Because, I mean, think about it. Blue masks all kinds of stuff. As a matter of fact, a tank that's blue oftentimes looks so pretty you don't see all the flaws. But you turn on white and it's like, ah, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. It's like, yeah, that's reality. So I recommend 10,000, 12,000, 14,000. That's a good crisp white with a little bit hint of blue. That'll get you good growth. It's nice to the eye. But if you want the crazy disco, deep blue like behind me right now for like late at night, then the 20,000 Kelvin is a good bulb. I really like the twin arcs, and I've been using them for so long that I've actually told Tulio, I said, look, I just want to buy like 50 of those so I have a good stash. All right, that video ended. Let me stick a different one in there. All right. Next question. Angry Owl Aquarium says, will a 0.5 degree temperature swing kill SPS corals? Absolutely not. Nope. My own reef tank has a swing of almost 2 degrees every day. It's warmer in the daytime and cooler at night. Part of the reason why it's cooler at night is because I keep the house cold and there's no lights heating up the tank. But 0.5 degrees won't do that to your tank at all. It won't hurt any corals or fish. Here's one. Greg says, if I have a quarantine tank with live rock and I have salinity at 1.026 and I buy fish that's at 1.021, can I lower the quarantine to 1.021 without affecting the nitrifying bacteria? Yeah, the bacteria will be okay at 1.021. However, it would be better to just acclimate your fish to the quarantine tank because the quarantine tank matches your reef tank. So rather than bringing the tank down to what the fish store had, I would gradually acclimate up to 1.026 over a period of a few hours in a bucket. So you can do the acclimation process, you can put a small heater in there, and you can put an air stone in there, and you could basically do it indefinitely until you get that salinity just right, then put the fish in quarantine and do your thing, and then when they're done with quarantine, they're ready to go on the reef. I wouldn't yo-yo your water in the quarantine tank. Ron says, what causes acroporas to turn brown after moving up from the bottom to the middle of the tank. That's kind of unusual. I think it might have been a coincidence, possibly. You know, it just happened around the time you moved it. Usually an acropore that turns brown does so because the nutrient levels in the tank are getting too much. It's just dirty water, and they kind of turn brown, and as you clean up the water, they get their colors back. That it could be that, or another thing it could be is that, I'm trying to imagine your timeline. So you bought a new frag, you put it down in your tank. It was gorgeous when you bought it. You're like, oh my God, I have to have this. You put it in your tank, you're super excited. You dipped it, then you put it in your tank down low. And it's there for, let's say, a couple of weeks to get used to your system, and now you're ready to move it up. Well, that super vivid coral may have turned to the browns already before you moved it up. And it's going through that, but then in another 6 weeks or so, it's going to regain its color. It could be that is happening. It's just, it was that thing where the new coral in your tank turns brown and gets its color back. That happens over a period of weeks, but it also goes away again. So there's that chance. And then finally, the other thing that might be happening is that you're seeing the side of the coral eye level now, and so it's boring, where before it was down low and it was all super colorful from above. So maybe if it's up high now in the tank, you should get up on a ladder and look down and see what it looks like, see if it still looks colorful or not, or if it actually is in fact turned brown. But it could have just turned brown because your water's different than where it came from, but that doesn't mean it's dead. Matter of fact, when I was at Frank's yesterday, Frank's Tanks is the fish store by my house. He had this rack and the lights weren't on, and I said, all those corals look dead. And he says, no, that's what happens whenever we move the entire rack of frags from that tank to this tank. And I was like, huh? And he said, well, you know, we dip them because I don't want to take any chance of getting a pest into the other tank. And the water's not the same. And so it shocks them and they lose their color. And in 8 weeks, they'll be fine again. And so I decided to go walk over there and take a look. And I said, you sure? These look dead. You know, it was just a whole rack of mostly pale and white. And he says, look, the polyps are all out. And I looked, and there was thousands of polyps. Like, wow, it really did lose all the color. So even, in a fish store where it went from one tank to another, they can change their color for whatever happened. Temperature changed, salinity changed, the dip medication he used, whatever happened, it does that. But he knows as long as they're alive, they can recover. And so your coral that was brown, as long as it's alive, it has a chance to look better again. So don't lose hope, but it could just be that. Brian says, I have an RO system with a bladder tank. How would you add your DI filter to that system? So the RO system with the bladder tank is designed for drinking water. And the way it works is the RO system pumps water into the bladder tank. The bladder gets compressed, creating pressure. So when you open a spigot to make drinking water, it expands, and as it expands, the water shoots out the spigot and fills your glass of water rapidly instead of the slow fill that would happen if you just had the RO water going straight to a spigot. You'd be standing there for about 2 minutes filling up a glass of water. It'd drive you crazy. To do the DI, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run a T-fitting so that your water from the RO goes either to the bladder tank or it goes to the DI. Okay, so you're splitting it. And you're going to have to put a check valve on the bladder line, going toward the bladder, so that that bladder can't push water through your DI rapidly. So that way, when you turn on the system, and then I would put a ball valve also leading to the bladder tank, and I would close it. So now you either have water going to the DI or you have water going to the bladder tank. You never have both going at the same time, and you definitely don't have the bladder water pushing water rapidly through your DI resin because you need the water to move through the resin slowly to remove the last of the ion from the water, so it can be deionized. And I actually have mine set up like that. Mine is in the kitchen, or it's in the utility room, and I have it split to where part of it goes through the wall, behind the refrigerator, behind the dishwasher, under the sink, to a bladder tank, and it has a check valve so that water can't come back. And then from the bladder tank, it goes up to a spigot. And then, I close that line, and then I open the other line, the line leads to the DI. So that's how I would do it. And if you need to, Brian, send me an email, and I'll send you my terrible drawing of how this works. Because I do have an ugly sketch. Adam says, any thoughts on putting a wart skin angler in a 6-gallon cube? Is that too small? It sounds too small, but is the fish itty bitty? If it's tiny, you might be able to do it for a while, but as that fish gets bigger, it's going to need a bigger tank. Sam says, how long until new zoanthids should be open, assuming all the nutrient levels are within good range? They could be closed because you've got a fish in the tank that's nibbling at them initially because they're new, or hermit crabs are climbing all over them, or sometimes there's something on them where they need to be cleaned off, like sponge growth, things like that. I would possibly dip them and use a very, very soft toothbrush to clean their little stems, their trunk, and then hopefully they'll open up. I wouldn't force them, I wouldn't do anything crazy, but sometimes they do need a little TLC. But sometimes they're closed for like a week or so. It does happen. But usually if they're closed, I would check multiple times a day and night to see if they ever open. Do they open late at night? Is there anything nearby that's stinging them, that's a bad neighbor? I mean, that kind of thing could be happening too. Robert says, why not put flow on that hydrometer tube for a constant salinity checker? Hey, that's kind of a cool idea. With a couple of John Guest fittings. Yeah, that's not a bad idea at all. Aw, Mike rained down on that parade. It's extremely sensitive, he says. Any algae, bacterial film, or spinoids will affect the readings. All right, never mind. I guess I won't do that. Kind of like that for a heartbeat. Looking for another question. Yagi1 says, do you usually try to stream at the same time on Saturday? Yes, it's always 2 o'clock Central Time. Usually it's 2:08 because things are always going that way. Someone says my image is reversed. That's not intentional. Let me see if I can fix it. Thank you for telling me. Those are those little details that sometimes... This, I'm trying to find the setting. That's not it. Yep, it says mirror. My mistake. Boom! Hey, it looks like my living room now. Thanks for catching that. We'll do this. Now I can't remember how I did it. Oh well, we'll do this for a little bit. We're going to wrap up soon anyway. Tristan says, I'm of the thinking that you can't use refractometers with some salt mixes such as Tropic Marin, and they insist on the hydrometer. I don't know. I would think that one device can measure them all, but it's possible. Crispy Critter Studios, what a name. It says, when inspecting the sponges of an inherited media reactor, it has a good deal of active carbon left stuck. I can't get it all out. Will it hurt my system? A lot of reactors have like some kind of a sponge pad at the bottom and the top, and one of the things you can do is you can try to clean that sponge in vinegar water. That is one technique that works. And you just squeeze it, wring it, shake it, hit it against a solid surface, kind of knock the harder particles out of it, but you probably won't get it back to like new condition. And I just do my best to clean it as best I can. If there's a smell to it, if there's a degradation of the sponge to where it looks pitted, like some kind of sulfuric thing happened, maybe I'd just replace that sponge with a new one. But other than that, I think that just cleaning in vinegar water would probably suffice. You could try something nutty like acid. Oh, speaking of acid, I did order a 5-pound bag of citric acid which is the friendlier stuff compared to muriatic acid, and I'm going to be using that to clean my protein skimmer. So that arrives in a few days. But I don't know. I mean, like I said, if you feel like you've cleaned it as best you can, you should be able to use that sponge relatively safely in your system. Mike says, you start, and I think he's talking to me. He didn't say at Milo's Reef, but he says, you started me in reefs 10 years ago. Thank you. Wow, that's cool. I didn't even know. Yeah, okay. I apologize for the Kalkwasser recipe number I threw out. It's been so long since I ever used it. Everyone's saying that's too much. So whatever it is you're going to use for Kalkwasser, please look it up and find out how much you need. Robert says, can dead spots in the reef create CO2 sinks big enough to drop the pH, enough to allow lanthanum chloride to leach phosphate back in the system? You shouldn't have any dead spots in your reef tank, first of all. You want chaotic flow everywhere. If you don't have enough flow in the tank, it definitely needs a few more power heads. When you're dosing lanthanum to remove phosphate, there are different places you can dose. You can dose it in the sump, you can dose it into a filter sock, you can dose it into the protein skimmer itself, but it's a slower method than the way I do it. But you should have good flow throughout your entire tank, and it should be able to, with enough flow in the tank, the solution should export the flocculant into something, whether it's a 10 micron sock or the protein skimmer sucking right out of the system. That's what you want. If your system really has that little flow, then lanthanum might not be the right choice for that aquarium. TX Jape says, were you successful using biopellets and dosing Prodibio supplements to control nitrate? Yes, I did the biopellets for about 3 years back in the day. And the reason I tried something different is I wanted to know what the other products were like, because people say, well, for example, people keep talking about Vibrant. I hear about Vibrant all the time, and I've never used it, so I have no opinion on it. So I did the biopellets, and then I stopped. I wanted to try something different. So I wanted to try like those bricks you put down in your sump. It's a big old ceramic-looking brick. I wanted to see if that would remove nitrate, and I didn't have much success. Then I said, well, let me try Nopox. Everyone talks about Nopox. So I tried that out, and that was a big mess, and I hated it, so I stopped using that. I've got a turf scrubber running right now, and it's competing with my Refugium. And but I think this protein skimmer not doing its job, which is crazy that I didn't notice it until recently. But now that I've come to the conclusion there is a flaw in my system, maybe it will course correct. Maybe I'll get things back on track, and the turf scrubber will do its job. And the number, I mean, this is the only number that's a problem in my tank. Everything else is really looking good in range. I mean, like, man, I have no fears when I test water. You know when you're testing your tank, you're like, oh, my alkalinity's wrong. Oh, my calcium's wrong. Oh, my magnesium's wrong. My salinity's wrong. My temperature's wrong. It's so frustrating. You almost don't want to test because you don't want to hear the bad news. You'd rather just not know and be ignorant to it. But, I test all my numbers, and they're all like where they belong, except nitrate has been the bane of my tank. But maybe this will be the skimmer situation with some now skimming wetter and with a couple of nice fresh pumps in there. Maybe it'll do exactly what I need. Hillbilly Reefer says, you have a neat house. Sometimes the kitchen's on the right, sometimes it's on the left. It's so funny. Tolga says, I use a balanced 3-part additive for my tank, but the tank consumes a little bit more KH than calcium. Do I add extra KH buffer or increase the 3-part amount? You're going to want to increase the one thing you need more of to get it to be the right number. So while initially you were taught, I need equal part of A, B, and C, for example, you might discover you need more A, but B and C can just be the same number forever. Or you might find that you need more A, B is great, and C is too much. And you'll just find whatever works for you, and you're going to dial it in. And then through the weekly testing, you're going to see if it stays dialed in or if you have to make some minor adjustment to increase situations and make it better. Macy's Daddy says, Tammy's tank update would be great. Thanks. Thanks for the reminder. Does she share on social media where we can see it? Nope, she does not. Dave says, if I'm dosing Prodibio's Bioptim Biodigest, should I dose before water change or after water change? Every 2 weeks for water changes in Prodibio. I would do it after the water change because why would you pour something in that you're going to pump right out of the system? So I would do the water change and then I would add the Prodibio. That way you've got that batch in the water for the next 15 days. JS says, I don't want to flood the chat too much. JS, we are way beyond that point. I have passed so many of your comments in this chat today. You have had a heck of a conversation. Derek says, I noticed Mark had the Trident in stock and on sale on his site. I did, and it's sold. So it's out of stock again. Let's see. Saif says, do you have any preference for sump design? I can't make a decision on the exact design. Well, the Model F layout is the popular one that most people like to copy. And it is probably the most sold sump I build. That sump has, it's got the skimmer section at one end, the refugium at the other, and the return is in the middle. And you can have the water level lower for the protein skimmer and higher for the refugium. Put my hands here where you can see both hands. So you're lower for the skimmer section and higher for the refugium. And you've got less flow through the refugium pouring down the wall, and you've got more flow coming through the skimmer section. It combines in the middle and goes back to the tank, whether an internal or an external pump. That sump is something I came up with probably way back in 2003 when everyone else did skimmer, refugium, return. Skimmer, refugium, return. That's all anyone did. And I was like, this makes no sense. I couldn't stand it. And I said, I think this needs to be changed. So I came up with that sump, and it's called the Model F because I started with A, got to F, and F was a good one. A was the sump under my 29 gallon, and I believe B was under my 55 gallon. And B was basically an F, just a weird shape. It was like a U-shaped sump. But anyway, the F is a really good one, but it depends on your tank and what you're trying to accomplish. And you know, we have so much gear these days. For example, people want like an algae reactor, and so they feel they may not need a refugium. So do you want to allocate that space for a refugium that you're not going to use? Or maybe you want to use an algae reactor, or maybe you want to use an algae turf scrubber. And so with these different devices, you may say, I don't need that. Or you might just say, I just want a skimmer section and a return zone. And in the return zone, I'll put all my equipment. I mean, these are all, they could be the equipment zone / return zone. So, I mean, it just comes down to what you're trying to accomplish with your tank and what you're comfortable working in. Smoking Reefer says, what additives do you add to your tank apart from magnesium, calcium, and alkalinity? So calcium and alkalinity is coming from the calcium reactor, so I don't actually add any. It's just something automated that runs forever. And that, matter of fact, I shared something on Instagram. Let me pop it up on the screen here. I made a thing the other day. I can't believe how many pictures I take daily. Okay, so, all right, let me answer your question though, and then I'm going to share this thing. Alkaline calcium is handled by the calcium reactor. Magnesium is magnesium pronto, and that's dosed every day with a dosing pump. It puts in, I think 80 milliliters a day. And then I did have AquaPower, but I ran out. And so that's not being added. So I guess the only thing I am adding at this point is Prodibio. All right, so this last week, speaking of the calcium reactor, I have a Versa pump that sucks water out of the sump into the Versa, and it goes out of the Versa into the calcium reactor. And I'm always very aware of the tubing in the sump because I want to make sure it was under the water at all times, and I want to make sure nothing got into the tubing that would clog it. And I noticed that the flow inside my refugium, inside my calcium reactor was coming out slower. And I thought that was weird, so I went into the Versa software and I recalibrated to try and get the number where it needed to be. If I said it should dose 60 milliliters in a minute, I should get 60 milliliters, but I was getting like 20 or 30. And so I recalibrated, and it wasn't quite working. I'm looking at the tubing because my tubing's opaque, and I'm kind of rolling between my fingers to like break up anything inside the walls that might be obstructing it. And I took it apart and looked inside, and I was like, what is slowing the flow? This shouldn't be a problem. So anyway, I did end up discovering some stuff in the tubing. And I took the tubing to the sink, and the inner diameter is very small. It's probably like an 1/8 inch, maybe 3/16, but I think it's more like an 1/8 of an inch. And it's hard to have any kind of cleaning tool to clean out such a narrow tube. So what I did was I took that tube in the sink, I tried to clean it out as best I could, I got some junk blasted out of it, and then I made myself a little filter. So, stick this on this, I think I'll do it this way. Actually, all these pictures are verticals, sorry guys. So, I'll make this a little bit bigger. What I grabbed was a pair of scissors. There's the tubing that goes to the Versa, this white opaque stuff. There's a cap with a hole drilled through it, the exact size of the tubing. I had this weird PVC strainer fitting that I owned, a couple zip ties, and this is a 10 micron mesh sock instead of a, I guess, felt sock. And so I decided to modify that. And what I wanted to do initially was take the fabric, and you can see it there in the background. I cut it with some scissors. I was going to wrap it around this weird fitting and then zip tie it on so water would have to flow through it. And I wanted to insert my tubing inside the middle of this thing so that way it was a pre-filter to prevent any kind of crap from blocking the tubing ever again. So instead I thought, well, I could just make a layer of it and roll it up and slide it down inside, and that way it's protected. And this piece of plastic is so heavy it'll stay at the bottom and it won't float, which was another important thing I needed. I needed to stay in the bottom of the sump in a spot. So I put the fabric in there. Then I ran the tubing through the cap that I drilled a hole for. And this is it, all assembled. It's just pushed together, it's not glued. I'm assuming I'm going to have to take it apart and clean it from time to time, or even replace that fabric. And I made sure that the tube was not all the way to the bottom because I didn't want it to suck against the hard plastic base. So you can see there it's a little bit away from the base. And then here it is installed in my sump. There's the Versa. There's the tubing going down, down, down. And there's my little guy standing up in the corner of the sump. And it's not going to clog up. I mean, I've been watching for the last few days, and there's so much surface area. That little tiny tube with its 1/8 inch hole or whatever it is that's drawing water is drawing nice clean water into my Versa at all times, so I don't pull any kind of detritus and clog up my calcium reactor. So I'm really happy about that. That was some little thing, and it was nice to cobble it together with stuff I already had here without a trip to Home Depot. Now the other choice was going to be to make some kind of an acrylic box of some kind with little pieces of acrylic, and then somehow affix that fabric on there, maybe with a hot glue gun or something, to seal it like a drum skin, and put a small hole to run my tubing in and set that little cube in my sump, and then you take it out from time to time and clean off the mesh with maybe a toothbrush. But for now, I like my little thing because it's small, it fits in the corner of the sump, it's easily seen, it keeps the tubing down exactly where I need it in the sump, so I don't have to worry about it sucking in air. I think it's a good solution. TX, thank you very much for the super chat, and I did answer this question. Sorry, you don't have to. I don't want you to feel like you have to pay to ask a question. I do appreciate the super chats though, and I do try to answer the questions. I'm just looking for questions to start with. Add Mila's Reef. Derby City Reefer says, I have a 6-line wrasse that will not let my 2 firefish come out from under my rockscape. They were fine together for 2 or 3 months, and I added 2 MP40s and changed the flow up. And is there more? I blame Jay for this. Jay talks so much, he probably stopped the flow of conversation. I'm kidding, Jay. Sort of. Okay, so the 6-line wrasse is kind of a semi-aggressive fish, and it could be bullying your little fire fish. That is a possibility. It does happen. The flow necessarily doesn't change, though it might a little bit for those fish initially, but they usually get used to the flow and they come out. But they may be way more reclusive now because of the 6-line wrasse. You might need to rehome the 6-line wrasse to be able to enjoy your fire fish more. Reef Trace Live, hey Jose, says, have you ever had issues with a closed loop setup? No, I've run closed loops in the past. It's just more plumbing. And you have to have the ability to remove the pump for cleaning or maintenance or even repairs where the closed loop doesn't drain your tank. So you've got to be able to close some ball valves to keep all the water in the tank while you're focusing on repairing whatever's wrong with the closed loop. But I've never run into any issues with one. It's a nice way to create flow in the tank, and it is something we did before we had things like vortex and gyres and waves and all these tunsies and all these other pumps that we put in our tanks. And it was a great way to have a nice reef with very little distractions, because you just had some holes in the walls of the tank where water would shoot out like the spa jet in a bathtub. Ira, thank you very much for the super chat. They said, we love the channel. Been watching since I first started the hobby in 2016. Keep up the good work. Thank you. Brockton says, what is the biggest mistake you've made with coral placement? Is your tank the result of years of attrition and only the strong have survived? That is a kind of a valid point, though, in a lot of tanks. When I see someone set up a reef tank and they plant, 50, 75 frags, I'm thinking you're only going to have 12. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Things are going to go wrong anyway because we make mistakes, and you're going to lose some of the corals you bought. Mistake with coral placement. I don't know if it's a mistake per se, but a lot of times we like to put Montipora up high in the tank because we like to see the flower petal thing that it does. It looks like a rose from above. And so we put it up high so we can look down from above and see it. But ideally, it's much better to put your Monties down low in the tank where you can enjoy the view, because if it's way up here growing and spiraling, you're going to see the side, which is really, really boring. And if you get on your tippy toes, you can see in a little bit, some of it, but you can't appreciate it until you get up on the walkboard or you get on a step ladder or you get on a chair and you look down in your tank. You're like, oh, it's so pretty. I wish I could see it all the time. If you put them down low, you get to see it, and it also won't create a ton of shade underneath it because it's already down low. So if you put your Montipora down low in the tank, that would always be smart, because you can plant all these other corals above it that will get plenty of light, and that Monty will still get the light it needs because it's making this big swirl. So that would be one. Now, I'm trying to think what's the biggest mistake I made on coral placement. That's a tricky one. I'm trying to think if I have any regrets, like, why did I do that? But I can't really... Okay, well, there was a little coral in the back of my tank. This isn't my fault, so we'll call it a mistake. I had this coral. It's a Lophavia. And it was sitting on the sand, and when Dwayne was helping me do the reset on this reef almost 3 years ago, he said, why is this on the sand? I said, well, I don't know. And he said, okay. So he just took it, and he took it out of the tank, and he put a big thing of glue on it, and he put it down on the rock. And it was about this far away from another little frag that I'd gotten at Aquashella. And then one night, I'm looking, with a flashlight, looking at the reef, and I see all these sweeper tentacles just destroying my little frag from Aquashella. And so I took a picture and sent it to Dwayne and said, Dwayne, look what you did. And he said, oh, I forgot that coral does that. And so he killed my little frag. So yeah, those kind of mistakes are what happens, and I didn't glue it there. So I don't get blamed for that one, other than I allowed it to happen. But yeah, sometimes we put corals near each other that shouldn't have been, and they do have chemical warfare and it can duke out. Sometimes they grow toward each other, and if you don't interact and create like a safe space between the two, sort of like, they do a fire break to prevent forest fires from going all the way across the mountain. Those little breaks between corals can help prevent conflict between them. That's all that comes to mind right now. Robert says, my potassium level is below 200. How should I increase that dose without stressing the tank? Are you sure it's below 200? Because that's really surprising. I would actually double check that test before I did anything. But if it is really there, find out how much you do need to dose to bring it up, and maybe shoot for raising it up, I don't know, 25 ppm once a week. So now you're 225, then you're 250, because you're trying to be somewhere around 380 to 420. So you're half of where you should be. Waleed Reef says, why do low nutrient systems require low alkalinity and vice versa? It's something we've just observed, that when you had a tank with very low nutrients with high alkalinity, the corals don't do well. A lot of times what happens is the tips get burned, and by lowering the alkalinity to a lower number, they seem to be okay. So I think it's really a chemical thing. It's a chemistry thing. And having the alkalinity nice and low, and I mean low, like 7, 7.5, which is crazy low to me. I was like, wow, I'd be stressing. I like 9, I like 10, but then again, I always have nutrients. I have nitrate and phosphate in my system. If both were down to near 0 numbers, like so many of you, I probably wouldn't be able to have this reef behind me. There'd probably be all kinds of chaos going on because I like my alkalinity too high. But then again, I would just feed heavier so I could keep my alkalinity up at a higher number. But that is basically the general rule. You're right. Low alkalinity for low nutrients, and then higher alkalinity for tanks with more nutrients. Adam says the wart skin is tiny. Well, the reason I said is it tiny, like you bought a baby kind of a thing. And they stay relatively small. They max out at 3.5 inches. So I think, the 6 gallon, it's kind of small. I mean, it'd probably work out okay. I like it. Maybe you could put the wart skin angler in there with some sun corals. That would be a really cool combination. And then, because it's such a small tank, you can feed the sun corals easily. You can make sure that fish is getting fed. I don't know, like you said, I want to try something, and I'd like a unique fish in there, and I could see that. The biggest problem with small bodies of water is pollution. And here I'm telling you to put in a coral that you have to feed all the time. That's probably bad advice. But then again, it's a 6 gallon tank. You can do a 3 gallon water change like that. It's no big deal. It's not like you have to deal with a whole bunch of cleaning. So yeah, I could see that. But like I said, just kind of observe and see how it does. You might decide you want to go larger later. Try it out for now. Why not? You seem to have the tank already. So get yourself a cute fish. I'm trying to understand what this says. I think he's saying, I found some food grade 5 gallon buckets with watertight lids for $11. And so it's great storage for salt mix, so it stays moisture free. That's great. That's exactly what you want. Yeah, a lot of bag salt, when I would cut open the bag and not use it all, I would then roll it down, and I would take packing tape and I would seal the bag so no moisture got in, because you don't want the salt to turn into a brick. I don't know what that says, so I'm going to skip it. Or, Marcus, could you retype this so I know what you're talking about? Oh, I think you're talking about the sulfur reactor, maybe? Brian, that's how bladder tanks work. There is one tube that goes in and out. So you are going to have to basically run enough tube to create different paths of water. Let's pretend the RO unit's off out of the side of the camera, and we've got a bladder tank, and we've got a fitting on the top with tube coming off of it. From that tube, you're going to put a T-fitting, and then it goes straight up to a spigot to like have drinking water on the kitchen counter. Then you have another T-fitting, and that runs a tube to the ice maker of your refrigerator. And then you have a check valve, and then you have another T-fitting, and that tube goes to the DI. And that way, all the water from the bladder tank either goes to the spigot or the ice maker of your refrigerator, but can't get past the check valve. Water only goes one way. And then anything before that would be RO water that can go to the DI. Algae Warrior says, would it be possible to connect a 10-gallon to my BioCube 32 without drilling? I want to do a refugium display. No. I mean, a hang-on back overflow box, but 10 gallons is going to have very low flow. It's going to be very slow trickle. Not a big fan. I'd rather see a hole in the side of that 10 gallon if you could drill that. And just so you know, 10-gallon tanks have very, very brittle glass. It's very easy to break them. They're cheap, but no one wants to buy the same thing twice. But if you could successfully drill that glass super cautiously, you could install a bulkhead and you could take a power head like a MaxiJet and push water from the 32 gal into the 10-gallon refugium and then have the water drain out of the 10-gallon refugium back into 32. Brockton says, is there a resource list available to determine which corals would tolerate other corals near each other? Some of it's going to have to just be homework. But you're thinking of almost like a fish compatibility chart, but it's like a coral compatibility chart. I don't know that there is such a thing because there's so many corals. But you could, say, well, I like these two corals and read up on both of them and see what kind of knowledge you gain from that. The book by Eric Bornemann called Corals for the Reef Aquarium, that one's an excellent book, which has a lot of scientific information, and you could learn a lot from it, and there's tons and tons of great pictures. I was just flipping through that just recently. I love that book. But it's not like can Galaxia be near this? It's not that kind of a book. Tim says, could you, man, my nose has been itching like crazy today. I'm totally aware of it. Could you, oh, I know why. I took a pain pill, so I'm getting a itchy reaction. That's what it is. All right. Could you make a nice, I don't know if it was on the screen, could you make a nice acrylic RO tube holder that can be put on the brute trash can or an option to clip onto a bucket, maybe even something to secure the waistline and the drain? Yeah, okay, so it might be possible, but it might be easier just find somebody with a 3D printer to make what you're asking for because RO tubing is so small. And they could make you some cool little bracket. Matter of fact, Reef Dudes could probably print something like that and then send you an STL file and you can print your own. But something out of acrylic could be made, but you see, a lot of times people are asking me for things that are really small, that are very hard to make on a big machine. For example, I call this the candy dish. So I had to make this for a customer. He's going to put it inside his top-off container. Look, it's got little bits of acrylic in there, just for fun. He wants to put this inside his top-off container because he's going to use Kalkwasser. And so he wanted to put this in the container and put the pump inside here, and he wanted an inch tall. So that way if there's sediment in the container, it won't get sucked into the pump because there's like this area of just clean water. So I made him this thing, and it was really hard to make this tiny thing because I'm dealing with acrylic that's 1/4 inch thick. It's a 3/4 inch strip. I had to make a rectangle. I had to make sure it's all nice and straight. Of course, I was trying to walk around all over the table, during the gluing process. And when I finally got glued, then I had to glue on the bottom. I had to route it. I mean, it's so tiny. I'm never making one of these again. And then I found these little cubes, so I threw them in there. So it's the candy dish. I don't make lots of little tiny things because it's so hard to make something like that with the things I use, the tools I have, the material I buy. I don't use 1/8 inch acrylic for anything, so I don't have that. It's almost easier for companies that have a laser cutter that can laser cut out these little tiny pieces, and using 1/8 inch is so simple to heat up and bend. It's just not ideal for me. But I do appreciate the request. Sometimes I just can't do it. Let's see. We're near the end. Oh my God. Okay, Robert, I feel a lot better hearing your potassium is 300. 300 is not bad. You're just down about 80 ppm. And you can definitely buffer that or potassium it up to get around 380. I would just do it over a couple of weeks. Again, like if you're using Tropic Marin, I think that's the one that makes it, or Fauna Marin makes the potassium solution. It just says K on the bottle. It'll say on there how much you need, and you could then add in, you know, small amounts daily. Like let's say you need a total of 100 milliliters. Well, what if you put in 10 milliliters a day for 7 days? That's only 70 of the 100. And at that 1 week mark, measure the tank and see where you are. And if you're only at 310, you know you can add it safely. But if you're at like 380, you're like, oh, okay, I didn't even need the full 100. So it'd be better to add a little bit and then check a week from now and see where you're at. And that would be how I would handle it. Michael says, I have a blonde Naso tang that will not eat. I've tried 3 different sea veggie colors, brine, mysis, 3 different types of flakes. I've soaked in Kent Garlic Extreme. Sometimes that fish can be a little moody. And when that happens, you're going to kind of notice like this hunger strike. But it could turn around and start eating again later. There's other foods too besides sheet algae. I mean, pellet food, flake food, frozen food that's been thawed out. You know, I like to throw banana in my tank for my Naso to chase down. These are all different choices. Krill is something that Spock likes a lot. You can break up the krill like it's a little horseshoe-shaped looking thing, and I just break it into smaller pieces and I toss it in, and she just eats them like confetti. So you've got a lot of choices, and you can just try different things until you find something she likes. And if you do, or I say she, could be he. Whatever your fish starts to like, I would probably focus on just using that for like the next week or so. But you can mix it with other foods, so it's a mixture of foods hitting the tank, and hopefully your tang will start picking up these other ones. But your tang may be not eating for another reason. It could be it doesn't like some of its tank mates, it doesn't like its reflection. You know, there's something's just different and it's irritating it right now. And so it's in a bad mood and it's just not wanting to eat. And over the 16 years that I've had Spock, there's been a few times where she refused to eat. But then, you know, after 5 or 6 days, she was like, all right. And she rejoined the crowd. Reef Trace Live? Never. That's his. Producer Reef says, why would my alkalinity go up instead of being consumed? My holding tank is running in reverse, and now I see bleached spots. All levels of PO4 and nitrate are 0. Alkalinity went from 8.3 to 9.9. I would stop dosing alkalinity since your nitrate and phosphate are so low. Like we were talking about earlier, with tanks with very low nutrients, you should have a lower alkalinity. So I would stop dosing that entirely. Oh, Desert Elephant said, I believe his biggest fail was not calibrating a brand new refractometer. You know, there was a guy, I mentioned this on the stream before since we're talking about saltwater and refractometers and all that. His water was in the garage, his salt water, and it was super hot, like 85 degrees or something, or 90 degrees. And he measured it, and it was 1.026. And then he brought it inside and let it cool off, and you know, he poured that in his tank through the water, you know, doing a water change, and his salinity went bonkers. And it turns out at 90 degrees, 1.026 is totally different from 76 degrees. And his salinity was much, much higher. I was thinking it was like 1.036 or 1.038 or something really high. So it's really important to make sure your temperature is correct when you're measuring your salinity. I feel like I missed a question here. George says, what corals can thrive in the same environment as Acropora, which would be in an area of high flow? Thank you. Normally what happens is you put your acropora, your SPS corals up high where they get a lot of flow, and then you put other corals lower in the tank that don't like a lot of flow. But there's a few corals that can handle more of a beating. The Acropora humilis is a nice chunky coral. I really like it. And if you can get that, it can handle a really good pounding from the water flow. The thicker the coral, like the Milka coral, that's another one can handle a lot of flow. It's usually the ones that are really brittle, really frail. They can't handle the intense flow. So that's why a lot of times you'll see birds' nest are put down a little bit lower in the tank because they just don't handle the intensity of the water hitting them and pounding them. You might be able to use a lithophyllon in an area of high flow, maybe. It's a super slow grower and it doesn't grow vertically. It just encrusts outward, so I don't know if you want that. Of course, you could put something like Pavona up there. It won't care about flow. Again, that's another encruster. But normally, I think what most people like to do is just put all the acropora across the top. Just lots of acropora. Mr. Reef Buster says, other than phosphate and nitrate, are there other parameters we need to monitor for a fish-only tank? For fish-only tank, really, the biggest things we look at, as far as I know, is going to be salinity and temperature and nitrate. Because it's fish only. Nothing else. There's nothing that's like major. You know, your water changes are going to bring in all the little elements that they may need. The salt mix has the alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium, and you don't have anything absorbing them like you would with a coral reef full of corals all sucking out of the water. So I would think phosphate and nitrate are the ones, and usually nitrate's really high in a fish-only system, so that's probably your biggest one. That's about it. And then Justin says, is there a difference in acropora growth when it comes to phosphate levels? Yes, the higher the phosphate, the more limiting the coral growth. So like, for example, I put corals in my tank. They take a long time to grow, but they grow. Dwayne puts corals in his tank and they grow like that. And in 6 months, he's got a rocking reef because he has really nice low phosphates. He is much better at that than I am. But I think I might be onto it. I think my skimmer was the problem. Can't believe it. Can't believe it took me this long to figure it out. I never put 2 and 2 together. I'm just astounded at myself. Tim says, you said on a previous broadcast you made PlayStation 4 controller holders. Where can I find that on your website? It was a one-off. We built it together. My son and I built them together, and then we hung it on the wall, and it was good. And there's still a hole in the wall where it used to be. But I don't even know what happened to the holder. But no, I've never made them again. Christian says, when's the next tank upgrade? I don't really want to do an upgrade. I mean, this one here was my dream tank. Oh my God, the itching is so bad. I am kind of in the mood for another tank, which I don't like to do because I have the anemone cube, and I've got the 400 gallon, and I've got the frag system that still needs to be reset. But I kind of liking the idea of possibly getting a cold water system, or maybe getting a non-photosynthetic system. Kind of leaning toward one of those. But I don't want to upgrade. But then again, you know, I also know there's going to be more water to test. There's more equipment to buy. There's more things to keep track of. But, you know, I kind of like to do something else. I might add another, maybe, who knows? Maybe at some point in the future, I'll have a fish-only system with some really cool fish. Maybe that'll happen. I don't know. That'd be nice because that would be limited effort. Waleed says, how do you keep the copper band alive? What did you feed her? Mine died after it ate all the aptasia. When I bought the copper band, I asked the fish store to show me that it was eating. And they put the food in the tank and she went after it and I said, give me all that food. And I brought that food with me. And I've been feeding that, I fed that food in my tank for weeks, along with all the other foods I use, and gradually weaned her off of that. Now she ate all the aptasia in my tank, and now she only wants, primarily, is the mini mysis from Hikari. And that is, and when I think 4 nights ago, I had not melted any food in time. The lights were about to turn off. So I put in a bunch of flake food. And I put all the flake food in the tank, and I'm watching all the fish go crazy. And that copper band gave me side eye so hard. I mean, their eyes on the side of their head, so it is side eye, right? But I was just like, man, I'm sorry. I don't have any mysis for you right now. And that fish was like, fine, just swam to the bottom, says, I'll just die down here. So I gave twice as much the next day. Yagi1, thank you very much for the super chat, says, thanks for your unwavering dedication to this hobby and helping all of us reefers. My whole family can watch and enjoy. Yes, we're a reef-friendly family. We can talk about things and not get in trouble. Revo says, does light spectrum matter for coralline algae? You know, actually, coralline algae grows in areas where it's really dark. I mean, yeah, it can grow in full light, but a lot of times people find it growing in the edges of the refugium or down in their sump or inside the overflow box, where there's very little light. So don't know so much about spectrum. I mean, obviously it helps to some degree, but it can do really well where there's very little light. It really comes down to really good water quality. If you have nice, stable water quality, you'll end up having really good coralline growth appear in your tank. And it's a kind of a sense of pride. You're like, I'm growing coralline. My water must be good. And then, then you eventually have too much coralline. You're like, oh, why is my water so good? I have too much coralline. So that happens too. Ken says, so if I understood this, I should be mixing my salt at 78 degrees. Well, we want to mix our salt to match our aquarium. And so, yeah, 77 to 79 degrees, that's pretty common for where we keep our reef tanks. So, yeah, we're trying to mix at that level. In the dead of winter, our water's really cold. And if you've ever tried to make salt water in cold water, you probably notice the salt doesn't seem to like to dissolve as well. It takes longer if it doesn't. Sometimes it just stays on the bottom. You're just like, wow, it's really not mixing. And then when the water is crazy hot, you're going to get a false reading, and your salinity is going to be way too high. So we want to get it just right. So that's why I like to mix the salt water in a barrel near the tank. And so like my poly tank is behind. It's in the same room as the aquarium. And I feel that, matter of fact, right now, that tank had about 60 gallons of salt water in it, and the salt was really high. It's probably something like, I think it was up there, like 1. I'm thinking it was like 1.040 because I was trying to bring up the salinity of my tank from 1.024 to 1.026. And so I had it a little higher in there. But now I was down to about 60 gallons left, and I went ahead and I just filled it with RODI to the top. So now it's hyposalinity again. So I've got to use a calculator to determine exactly how many pounds of salt I need to add to it to get it back to 1.026 so I can have more salt water ready for water changes. Mr. Reefbuster says, does Dwayne have a YouTube channel so we can see his amazing tank you keep talking about? No, Dwayne posts pictures of his reef tank, sometimes on Reef to Reef, usually on Facebook. And he also posts pictures in Club Milo's Reef. So sometimes he'll put pictures there, or maybe he'll put some video in there, some short little clips. He has to be in the mood, so it doesn't happen all the time. Smoking Reefer says, what's up with your skimmer? I was just saying earlier in the stream, it's somewhere around the 1 hour mark, that I have noticed that my skimmer was only pulling out a little tiny bit of skimmate, and I didn't really think about that. And so the fact that it wasn't exporting fluid on a regular basis is the reason I believe my nitrates have continued to go up and up, because I was not actually removing enough waste. I think that I was basically essentially skimming too dry, even though that wasn't really intentional. I thought everyone was working correctly, and it only occurred to me about a week ago, it's barely pulling anything out, and I need to change that. So I've been changing the knob on it to make the output closed, which forces more water into the body of the skimmer, which makes the cup overflow more rapidly. And yesterday I dumped out a container full of skimmate. Here is a picture of it by the sump. This was a day and a half worth. So you can see that it was almost up to the float switch, and I dumped that out. And then I think I took one more picture. So here it is with some daylight behind it. It doesn't look that dark in this, but I mean, that's normal. If you were in the bathroom and pour in the toilet, it wouldn't look that dark either. But so it pulled out this much, and then as of right now, there's about 1.5 inches inside the container. So that's good. I would much rather have it dump out that container once a week. I was seeing like this much liquid in that container for 2 weeks. And it just, all I cared about is that it didn't overflow. I didn't realize it wasn't pulling out enough stuff. I was like, well, this explains so much. It explains why my nitrates have been so stubborn. And it also explained why my phosphates have seemed to be more of a problem this year than previously. And I couldn't really understand it. But now that I've changed it to a much wetter skim, I think I'm going to get this corrected finally. And I'm kind of excited about that. Roy says, at some level of reef keeping with huge tanks, isn't it more cost effective to build your home inside the ocean rather than bringing the ocean to your home? Yes, that would be cool, wouldn't it? Joshua says, what should I put on the drywall behind my 150-gallon tank? If it's bare drywall, paint is the first step. And I like some kind of a material on top of it. For example, they have like a clear, sticky fabric that you can apply in the bottom of kitchen drawers. It's like a drawer liner. And you could apply that on the back wall, like right behind the tank for, you know, so many inches, and then go down behind the tank a little bit, and then maybe behind the sump as well. So if either of those areas spatter, they spatter onto your plastic drawer liner, then they are spattering on the paint job. I had a buddy whose wall just got destroyed by salt creep. Now, my anemone cube, it's this far from the sheetrock, and I painted it with a good coat of paint, and it's been like that for 6.5 years, and the wall looks perfect. There's no spatter because I don't have things that bubble happening in the tank, and it's just water moving inside the cube, and I don't have splashovers against the wall. But if you feel like there's a real problem back there, you might actually want a splash guard of some kind. You could even get a nice piece of clear acrylic. You could peel off the film, put a couple of holes, and actually screw it in and have this shiny piece of, you know, clear acrylic where you see the wall, but there's this nice protective splash guard. And I saw that when I was at IKEA. They had painted, you know, they have all these demonstrations of kitchens. And here's your kitchen counter, here's your sink, here's your magnetic holder for all your utensils, here's your cool little light. But they had this strip of acrylic across the back against the splash, you know, against the back wall. I was like, dude, I could totally do that. I have acrylic. I was like, what a great idea. And it's something you can wipe off really easily too. So that'd be kind of neat. It just comes down to what you like looking at. Oh, by the way, back to the copper band, I saw Marcus was answering something about that. He said he had one that wouldn't need anything. Sometimes you can put in a clam, and you know, not the nice, not a Maxima, but like clams from the deli. You can break them in half and set them in the bottom, and your copper band might go after that and eat that. But that could be a very expensive feeding mechanism if you can't get that fish to eat other foods. All right, we're going to wrap this up in about 8 minutes or so. Justin says, what are the basics of anemone health? I seem to struggle there. What's the feeding schedule, the light, the flow? I have a rittery and 2 bubble tips. They don't seem to grow. Well, the fact you have a rittery with bubble tips could be part of the problem because you put 2 different species in the same body of water and they don't tolerate each other very well. So that could be a problem. Feeding-wise, you could feed the anemones something small the size of a lima bean twice a week. And then flow should be enough where they're moving well, but they're not being blown off the rock. They definitely should not look like they're just sitting there barely moving. There should be some activity in the tank. I like chaotic flow. And you definitely want to protect all of your intakes of pumps in case any of those anemones decides to walk so it doesn't get sucked into a power head and chewed up. But lighting, it's going to be LED. I mean, basically, I have a bubble tip anemone video you could watch. It's about, I don't know how long it is, 16 minutes or so. And it talks about the needs of those anemones and everything I have to say about them. But I don't like that you've got the rittery in there with those bubble tips. I don't think that's going to do well. In my big reef right over my shoulder right now, that's my sea bay. I've had it now for about 4 or 5 years. And the flow is this way across the top. And it changes because those are the random flow generators from VCA. So it shoots water at different angles constantly. But you can see the movement of the tentacles. It's not huge movement. And then I've got Vortec pumps pushing water this direction against the water going this way. And that anemone, for the most part, stays exactly where I put it. Jake says, auto water change question. The Neptune dose, is it better near the tank or 15 feet away at the water source? I believe it doesn't really matter with that pump. I think you could have it wherever it's convenient. I would kind of imagine you might want it 15 feet away because of the sound of the pump when it's running. That's just my assumption. You can just try it out and see how you like it, and you decide where you want to keep it, officially. Scott says, how are you doing? Well, thank you for asking. I'm doing okay. Guys, I feel like some of you are just getting here and I am wrapping up. So I want to remind you, today is Water Test Saturday. Please do test your water. Make sure your skimmers are nice and clean. Come join us on Club Milo's Reef. Let me throw that on the screen. I didn't do any promotion at all today. So Club Milo's Reef is a group that I set up just about 2 years ago. We're coming up on our 2-year anniversary. We have a lot of people posting pictures, asking questions. We are an environment where you can ask things without being made fun of or attacked or picked on. And I always say that every single time because that's the whole reason I made the group. I wanted a place where I can, if I want to go somewhere and ask a question, I want to ask it without being belittled. And so we made it that way, and we have moderators there to keep the peace and make sure everyone's being nice, and we remove things that are not. And we remove people that are not. So it's a one chance. You blow it, you're gone forever. We do have a really good rules video. It's about 5 minutes long in there. Please watch it if you haven't yet, because it just basically goes over all the parameters of what makes it a good group and how we keep the peace. And then also I want to throw this on here as well because I need to. Thank you very much when you buy things from Milo's Reef, because you're helping pay for what I do. And this is my business. This is the only thing I do. I sell and build acrylic products for customers. I sell a lot of dry goods. I don't sell any livestock, and I educate. And so this is what I've been doing full time since 2009. That's when I decided Milo's Reef was going to be my sole source of income. So when you guys buy things, I really appreciate it because I know you have options with so many other companies. And I am always selling the things that I use myself because I've used them and I feel good about them. And I'd say 94% of what I sell, I use myself. There's a couple of things I've added recently I just absolutely have no need for, but you guys do, so I added it to the shop for you guys. Like Neophos was one thing where you can dose phosphate, Neo Nitro where you can dose nitrate. I will never be dosing those things, but you guys needed it, so I sell it. I also have Reflux, which is used to get rid of bropsis. I have no bropsis, but I have it in the shop in case you need it. So there's that. And so I appreciate whenever you guys buy things because you're feeding Spock and you're feeding me. And I believe I will be here next weekend for another live stream. I feel like I have a trip coming up, but that just depends on everything. In the meantime, please stay safe out there, guys. I know there's a lot of debate. I really recommend wearing masks. I wear masks around everybody when I'm out and about, and I try to be out and about as little as possible, because I don't want to catch coronavirus. So that's how I'm going to end this stream, talking about something political. It's not political, it's a virus and I don't want it. Bye, guys.